we will get. Thanks, Cameron. Okay, assuming there's some people. Oh, that's really unfortunate. I'm just looking at the chat right now where it appears that the link that's in the agenda is not the right link. So I wonder if Melissa's available this morning to help us quick update that link and repost it online.
I don't believe Melissa is supporting these full council meetings anymore, but Jane just wrote a note and said she was going to work to fix it now.
Great. That would be really helpful. And not quite sure what happened there. Again, it's like gremlins hard at work. All right, folks. Well, Jane is working to get that going. Let's get our meeting going. Welcome to a meeting of the full council. We've got a really interesting agenda today, and I'm just going to throw that in the chat again so folks can click on that agenda. I'll ask Secretary. I'll ask Secretary Young to
yes. Good morning. It is Monday, June 28th. This is a meeting of the full Climate Council. It is being hosted physically in the Catamount Room at National Life for members of the public to attend and participate. It really would be great to make sure we have that link for the attendees or the public. Am I correct, David?
That's right.
Okay.
Well, it's the participant link for the public. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe Jane could report before we get too far into the meeting when that is up. And let's see, the first agenda item is basically to review the agenda. First order of business will be to approve the minutes of May 24. We'll then have a conversation with our invited speaker, Amy Kahn, the director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School, regarding putting environmental justice principles into policy. Jane will lead us through a conversation about options for supporting subcommittees with the just transition work. We'll take a break, and then we'll talk about assembling the climate action plan and go through a reminder of upcoming milestones in the agenda, in the work plan. Jane and Cadmus will give us an orientation to the work of our technical consultant, Cadmus. We'll take public comment and then just run through next steps. So it's a pretty busy meeting. Let's see. Is there anyone who would like to discuss the agenda, make amendments or otherwise to it? I am seeing no hands. Oh, I do see a hand. Catherine?
Yeah, good morning. I'm a little concerned about starting the meeting if the public can't actually access the meeting yet. It seems like we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I am hoping that we get that participant link up on the website, and Jane is shaking her head. Yes, we're in the same room, that has occurred.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just say that the website's still on AOA's website, and so only Melissa can do it. So I've sent it to her.
Great. So
Melissa, actually, Jane has had to deal with Melissa because it is on the AOA website. So are we awaiting confirmation, Jane?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're awaiting confirmation. So maybe we should just take a minute and make sure that that's up. Thank you, Catherine.
Great. So we can just ensure that is up. Now, one thing we could do, Jane, if you could throw into the chat the correct link for participants, and then all of you council members, if you have networks of folks who you know are interested in these meetings, if you could just cut and paste that link out and throw it into your network emails. We'll just take a moment. Again, it's an unfortunate snafu, but the link that's right now in the chat if anyone knows folks who would want to be listening in today or has an email list that typically announces these meetings, please feel free to cut and paste that out and shoot that out over email with the correct link. And we'll take a moment to let folks do that. Hi, Rich. Good morning.
Sorry, that was a mistaken raised hand.
That's fine. It's good to hear your voice. Good to see you. All right.
Melissa's updating it right now.
Wonderful. Okay. So I just want to check, Catherine, since you raised the concern that we shouldn't start until there's a link that's up and running, I just want to check to make sure what that start moment is in your mind so that we do this in a way that you think is appropriate. Catherine, you still there?
I am. I didn't realize you were asking me. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm just curious what you had in your mind there.
Well, I just think until if the link is posted and we give folks a few minutes to try to join on, and we see that there's some panelists, some participants joining in the link, and that's working, that to me would be comfortable, but I would really leave it up to the chair's discretion on that.
Great. Great. Okay, and I do
Thank you,
see we start.
Catherine. Yeah, well, I would think once we start to see attendees join, we should start the meeting in earnest. So
I see one person joining now, so something's working. So Secretary Young, I'll leave it up to you when you feel comfortable that we do have one attendee joining. I can see Jane will give you the heads up when Melissa's posted the agenda. Anybody else, feel free to shoot out an emails to your constituents and other folks the correct link. We are also recording this meeting, and it is also in a physical location, just so everybody knows. So there's multiple pathways of transparency here. Okay, Chris, why don't you go ahead, and then I think we'll start the meeting.
So we verified that the link is up. Jane has sent the link to all of the subcommittee members. To your point, David, this is being recorded and it is in a public place. But I think next meeting we'll just make sure those links are out. I hope on Fridays or first thing Monday, and we won't delay the meeting anymore. So thank you again for those who are just joining. Apologies for the delay. We have the link for the public to link to the meeting. We're also holding this meeting at National Life in the Catamount Room, and the meeting is being recorded for later view. And again, we are always open to public comments through the website, and we can put that up in the chat as well. So we were just starting the meeting. We reviewed the agenda and we were asking if there was anybody who wanted to amend or change or discuss the agenda.
Yeah. Thanks, Secretary Young. Chris, were you trying to jump in on something? You all set? Okay. Okay. Great. So look, Secretary Young, we're good to go on the agenda. Would you like me to dive in? Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. Apologies again. All right. First thing to do, approve the minutes, and they are linked to the agenda. So please take a moment if you haven't already to look at those. And this is an opportunity to raise up any concerns you might have or improvements to those minutes. So I'll give everybody just a moment to make sure if you wanted to click through those, you can. These are the May 24th minutes from our last meeting. Any concerns about those minutes before we deem them to be approved? Any improvements to them? Okay, so I'm not seeing any concern about that. We will treat those as approved by you all, the council. Thanks so much. All right, so let's get to the first piece of what we wanted to do today. And as you remember, we said in the last meeting, we were hoping to create this moment of reflection and inspiration around just transitions in every meeting we have. And that's why we've invited today another speaker to give us some thoughts. And so Amy Laura Kahn, we are so happy to have you with us. As Secretary Young said, you are the director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law School. And in your conversations with Jane, preparing for this meeting, you had mentioned a particular interest in talking about how environmental justice and just transitions find their way into policy or not. So we're eager to hear from you. And if you want to share slides or anything, just do that, or and you should be able to do that, or Cameron can make sure you have the power to do that. So welcome, Amy, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. And can you hear me okay?
You're okay. Your internet's a little bit it's laggy, it sounds like. Well, let's give it a try.
Okay. If I have to go work on that, I'm staying with my mother right now, who has just had hip surgery. And so the technology is a little not the best. So, so thank you all for having me. And David, as you said, I'm actually acting director of the Environmental Justice Law Clinic at VLS. I stepped in for Marian Engelman Lotto when she went to join EPA in February, and I came there from the Conservation Law Foundation, where I had been directing the environmental justice work regionally for the past 2.5 years. And I've been working on environmental and climate justice work since 2003, first as an organizer and then as an attorney. And I practice what I would call community-based movement lawyering. So I do work hand in glove with communities where we use the law as a strategy, as part of a larger organizing strategy. And that work is led by communities, and it's part of contributing to the larger environmental and climate justice movements. And I've worked very closely with communities dealing with resilience and adaptation issues, dealing with issues of around mitigation and how loss and damage, and how we work on this transition in a way that both redresses past harm and then also moves us towards a more just future. And I'm going to start a little bit unconventionally right now, because you know your state more than I, and you know your process more than I. I participated in the Just Transition workshop that about a month ago, which is how I find myself invited by Jane. But you've really been in it, and I'm actually want to put it out to you all, because I'm curious, what are the questions, not necessarily the questions you have for me, but what are the questions that you're grappling with around just transition right now? And then I have a presentation and I can kind of shift gears into that, but I kind of want to hear from you all, what is top of mind? And feel free to put something in the chat or raise a hand or just kind of pop in. When you think about, how do we put environmental justice principles and climate justice and just transition principles into policy? So what are you trying to grapple with right now?
Don't be shy, folks. Jump right in.
I know you have questions, or you would have it figured out, but none of us do.
Chris?
Just, I was on the subcommittee that helped draft the principles, and I fully support them. what I'm curious about are examples that you may be aware of where just transitions have really happened in terms of policy and policy implementation. It's the actual execution. And something else that was noted in some of the other subcommittee meetings that we talked about a lot in the subcommittee, but we didn't talk about enough, probably in our public presentations, are the inequities, the injustices associated with the status quo, and communicating that along with the goals that we need to make as we go through the transition too.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Anyone else?
Quiet crowd you got, Amy, this morning. Abby?
I just know we've talked from time to time, you hear the phrase win-win policy. And I'm wondering if we can have some help examining the fact that perhaps I'm just cynical, but I don't think that many policies are completely win-win. And I think that addressing them as such sometimes leaves out the nuance of who loses in that process instead of facing it up front and trying to mitigate the harm in the beginning of the process. And so any guidance as to how to navigate those conversations and, you know, have those pieces engaged in the policy at the beginning would be very helpful. Thank you.
All right, I'll see if there's one more and then I'll shift gears.
Joey, you want to go ahead, please?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Well, Amy, Laura, I'm curious from your perch to like kind of along the lines of what Chris asked, but a little bit different. Like, who else is doing this well, and what can we learn from them? Considering we're going in deep and we want to do it well. Like, what else can we learn? Yeah, if you have any insight there. And then I guess another question is, I know you've been involved in the drafting of the environmental justice bill, and I'm curious your thoughts on how that could overlay our process. So 2 questions.
And my very quick answer to that question is that it should overlay, and then the question is, how do you get the language right to have it be an environmental justice legislation that applies broadly, but we can come back around to that. So I am going to shift gears, and I think I always debate sharing slides, but I think I'm going to go for it. And they're a little bit text heavy, but I can share them so you don't have to all take notes. I can share them after the fact so that you have them available to you. But I think sometimes in this case, maybe having it available will be helpful. Except I'm going to share play from start, and then I don't know how to wait a minute. Sorry. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
I think I'm sharing. Yes, sharing screen, and then
You have to click on the individual window you want to share.
play from. Are you good?
No.
Do you have a PowerPoint now?
Now, here it comes. My only challenge, I have a little sneaking suspicion, Amy, that this may, because your internet may be a little slow, we may run into some challenge with this.
All right,
Is
we're going to
my
go
only
without the
sneaking
PowerPoint then, 'cause I'd
suspicion.
rather. Okay, we're going to go without the PowerPoint then, and I'll share it with you afterwards so you have it.
That's a
So,
great plan.
okay, so I want to actually take us back, and as I've been reflecting myself on kind of the history of the environmental justice movement, and it's really important in this moment when we're at a crossroads on climate to go back 40 or more years, because there's some really critical lessons for this moment. And if you had my slides, you would see, I will send you to, if you have not read the Washington Post article on the beginning of the environmental justice movement. It's a story map article. It's beautiful, called How a Protest in a Black North Carolina farming town nearly 40 years ago sparked a national movement. And it starts with a quote from a man named Ben, or a quote from Ben Chavis. It says, Ben Chavis was driving on a lonely road through rolling tobacco fields when he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the state trooper. Chavis knew he was a marked man. Protests had erupted over North Carolina's decision to dump 40,000 cubic yards of soil contaminated with cancer-causing chemicals in a poor Black farming community in Warren County, and Chavis was the leader of the revolt. The trooper pulled him over. What did I do, officer? Chavis asked that day in 1982. The answer shocked him. He told me I was driving too slow. Chavis was arrested and thrown in jail. When the cell door slammed shut, he gripped the metal bars and declared, "This is racism, environmental racism." And many people will point to that as the start of the movement. Other folks will actually send us back to Martin Luther King and the sanitation worker movement, and really the links between kind of economic injustice and racial justice. And in that, bringing folks together across a whole set of movements, our civil rights movements, immigrant rights movements, farm workers, coming together to really organize around how whole sets of communities have been disproportionately burdened by environmental and now climate harms and lacked the access to environmental benefits and solutions. And you have to really look at those two things hand in hand. One is this overburdening of communities and how race is the greatest predictor of those burdens, but also the lack of access to the solutions. And in 1990, the Southwest Organizing Project brought together a whole set of EJ groups, grassroots, community-based, people of color-led EJ groups, to write to a whole set of environmental groups known as the Big Ten. So, the Sierra Clubs of the world, folks that we know well and are our partners in this work, and to this day. And the letter said in 1990, although environmental organizations calling themselves the Group of 10 often claim to represent our interests, in observing your activities, it has become clear to us that your organizations play an equal role in the disruption of our communities. There's a clear lack of accountability by the Group of 10 environmental organizations towards at what was then called third world communities in the Southwest, in the United States as a whole and internationally. And so I point to that because we're still grappling with that same dynamic. And in 1990, it was sort of a dynamic of, well, the environment is not about people. We have things that affect people over here, and we have things that affect the environment. And there was this divide, and the resources went to the environment. It went to the charismatic megafauna. It went to kind of air quality and water quality, but not to create strategies to protect people, and particularly people of color, low-income people, immigrants and refugee communities. And so in organizing, the grassroots, people of color-led and indigenous-led groups came together and created a set of environmental justice principles in 1991. And I'm hoping you will have seen them. I'm hoping that they are inspiration for your principles. They're inspiration for my work on a daily basis. There are 19 of them. I won't read them all, but I keep returning to one in particular, number 5, which says, environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. And then number 7, which says, environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. So really detailed, a kind of detailed principle of how participation needs to happen, and that self-determination is at the center. Communities most affected by environmental burdens, risks, and harms need to be defining what their futures look like. And then jump ahead about 5 years, and that same group coming together to create what are called the Jemez principles for democratic organizing, which is really about how the work happens. be inclusive, emphasize on bottom-up organizing, let people speak for themselves, work together in solidarity and mutuality, build just relationships amongst ourselves, and commit to self-transformation. And that self-transformation being, individually being, but also, collectively being in right relationship with one another, and working on our organizations, whether we are an environmental justice organization or not. It's really about doing the work internally and also in collaboration. And then lately have been kind of jumping to the executive order, the Clinton executive order of February 11th, 1994, which is really in kind of our guiding principle in policy. It is the kind of the core principle of how environmental justice has been addressed at the federal level, but it's also had a great influence at a state and local level of how we define environmental justice. And it says to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law, each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by identifying and addressing as appropriate disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of the programs and policies and activities on minority populations and low-income populations in the US territories and possessions. And it, there's a whole sort of set of, there's more specificity there, but it really guided the definition of environmental justice that EPA developed shortly after, which said environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regs, and policies. And this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making processes to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And there's a discrepancy here. This sounds good, absolutely. And we needed something in 1994 to kind of move us forward, but we haven't really moved that far from that moment in policy. And if you look at, and you sort of look at the environmental justice principles and the HIMSS principles next to the executive order and the EPA definition of EJ, you see what has fallen out. And that's really this self-determination piece. And the fact that, we have never, 1994 on, but also prior, put the people most affected, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities at the center of the process of, and going back to the as equal partners at every level of decision making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. And so the question is, becomes, right now, how do we do that? But I think there are some lessons learned from the climate space of what's kind of happened to date and how we've fallen short. And we've fallen short both, internal to policymaking. So, within government, but we've also fallen short as environmental movements. And, I hate to beat up on market-based solutions, but I'm going to beat up on market-based solutions for a moment to make a point around process. And we can argue about the value of that as a strategy, but there are concerns to be raised around how those policies are emerging, looking specifically at California, looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and looking at the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And I will say, straight up, I don't live in California. I have never worked in California, but there are a lot of observations, and it's pretty well documented, kind of what's occurred to date. And there's a great book that I will point you towards that just came out called Climate Change from the Streets: How Conflict and Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement, that really documents what happened there. But I have some first-hand experience from Reggie and from TCI. And what I can say is that, the flaws in the process, to really simplify it, is that, as climate policy started to, the discussions of climate policy started to emerge, the patterns that the EJ groups pointed out in 1991 really kind of played out again. That, we had, climate as an issue was was over here, and sort of impacts on people and impacts specifically on BIPOC communities were sort of over here as a sort of separate issue. And that, the idea was, well, we're facing this catastrophic scenario, and that what we need to be doing is kind of ratcheting down climate emissions in the aggregate, and that will have benefits across the board. And that sort of and I'm simplifying, and many in the room know as much or more than I about the science, about the policy, but just to sort of say that there has been this tone that we need to move quickly, we need to do things in the aggregate, and that's sort of separate from what we might need to do at, impacts at the local level, because if we have these aggregate benefits, they're going to benefit everyone. And the result in California, and there are debates about the data, but the results in California have been some real concerns about, aggregate benefits with pollution hotspots, and aggregate benefits in terms of, the raising of resources, but those resources not going to the communities who have been harmed over and over by, disproportionate siting of emitting facilities and degraded air quality, and from the range of emitting facilities, including transportation. That pattern, so that's sort of very much simplifying the sort of California example. I will say that it is well documented in the book that I pointed out to you. It's also well documented in the case making from the EJ community about why not to appoint Mary Nichols to the EPA administrator position. And the EJ leaders really kind of went through sort of point by point how they were ignored in the policymaking process, and what harm that caused, and also how that sort of ignoring of BIPOC communities and policymaking was mirrored by ignoring BIPOC folks internal to the California Air Resources Board. Looking sort of very briefly at RGGI, we have, some similar patterns kind of playing out there as well. In many ways, we haven't really had the data to understand whether, and I think from what I can tell, talking to folks at Union of Concerned Scientists and other ways, the data is sort of more complicated as to, what's the kind of cost benefit in terms of the aggregate emissions relative to the amount of resources that have been generated, and whether we've sort of emerged with any sort of pollution hotspots. We know that RGGI has worked in terms of ratcheting down the emissions. We know that it has generated resources. We also know that those resources have not gone to the communities most in need of support. We know that in a couple of different ways. One is that the RGGI resources in certain states like New York and Connecticut have been diverted to the general fund in what we kind of colloquially will call a RGGI raid. In Massachusetts, where I've spent the most time on this issue, the resources are going to energy efficiency, but they're disproportionately going to communities that are whiter and wealthier, and they're not going to the communities that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, low-income communities, and those communities have actually been kind of and even middle-income households, small businesses, and particularly people with limited English proficiency have not benefited. And those communities have often been labeled and are in the RGGI context labeled hard to reach. And it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy that I'm sort of seeing over and over again, that we're labeling communities as hard to reach, and then those communities remain hard to reach. When in fact, if you go and you engage with folks, they're very interested and want to be a part of the process, but it's not accessible. And then I will sort of jump to the TCI context where, which is, I think relevant, has been, Vermont has been part of that conversation as well. And with, you all may be as familiar with that process as I. What I saw coming into the TCI policy conversation, kind of early 2018, was that there were no EJ groups being engaged across the TCI region, which at that time included a lot of states. That there had been, almost a decade of engagement kind of behind closed doors, that there were then, that the doors, with policymakers at the table, that sort of emerged this process with a fairly kind of pre-baked idea of what the solution was. And that kind of very late in the game, the communities most impacted by transportation emissions were suddenly like finding themselves very much in a very late part of the conversation, and raising a whole set of concerns that were ignored for a period of years, and sort of watching, and including, what are going to be the overall emissions reductions of this program? What are going to be the targeted emissions reductions program? How do we ensure that we don't have the hotspot issue, but that we are also, providing benefits for the communities who have been overburdened by the co-pollutants to GHG emissions? What will be the impacts of increased electrification on EJ communities? And how do we create the guardrails for governance over distribution of investments, particularly looking at the RGGI example, where we have that RGGI raid problem in some states, and where we just have a disproportionate or a lack of resources going to the communities that need the most. And just in general, this sort of pattern of bringing communities in late who should be there, who should be part of the process early on. What we're seeing, and what's been interesting with RGGI, is that we're actually seeing potentially things shift and change even late in the game. If you look at sort of the original documents a decade ago coming out of the TCI states, there was very little mention of equity. When you look to the MOU at the end of last year, there's definitely a shift in the language. There's definitely a shift in the engagement. And there's starting to be, I think, some traction from the environmental movement to say, hey, like, we need to take a beat. We need to listen. We need to understand what the concerns are, so that we can create something that's actually responsive to the communities that need it most. So I think, I'm definitely watching that process because I'm interested to see, how can we do what we don't often do, which is actually to take a pause, to listen, to take some time and actually listen to the Hermes principles, and make the time to be in relationship to for something to emerge. And this is kind of where, you have the opportunity in Vermont to really do that differently. You're at the beginning of your process, and you have the opportunity to kind of create something from the ground up that is responsive to the communities that have historically been overburdened, and create something that is potentially transformative. I think, some general principles that I have kind of coming out of particularly the TCI process, but also kind of looking at that discrepancy between the original EJ principles and kind of what we have as a standard perception of EJ. We need to, a couple of things just very clear. One is, we need to put things in historical context. That we need to understand, to be able to move forward, we need to understand the history of harms. We need to understand the history of kind of marginalization. And we need to account for that in process to be able to create something new. But even just to be able to build relationships with communities who have an expectation that they will potentially be marginalized. We also need to think about kind of more holistic views of harms and solutions, and really putting understanding kind of cumulative impacts, but also transformative solutions. So when when we're thinking about in the climate context, one of the flaws that I kind of keep pointing out is, if you only think about GHG emissions, which don't necessarily have a kind of immediate health impact on someone's respiratory system, you're not thinking about the sort of full, kind of wraparound impacts of the emissions themselves, when, on a daily basis, individuals are being harmed. So you need to kind of, the problem is bigger than just GHG. And then the solutions have the potential to, can we think about solutions that are not just about kind of aggregate reductions, but about actually, redressing the past harms and also, shifting power and shifting public health, looking to the future. So, if in the transportation context, why not focus first and most on solutions that have the kind of most aggregate benefit in terms of air quality in places that are most overburdened? Start there. There's a climate benefit, but then there's also an air quality benefit, and you're also redressing some of that past harm. One of the things that we've also been working on in Massachusetts is paired with the climate legislation and paired with EJ legislation, we're advocating for civil rights legislation to make sure that, what we do not have at a federal level and what we don't have except for in Illinois and California are protections against the disparate impacts of discrimination. We have protections against intentional discrimination, but it's very hard. We don't have a private cause of action. We don't have the ability of communities to go to court and ask for redress based on disparate impacts. We have to rely on federal agencies, and EPA in particular is not a very good enforcer of civil rights, although we'll see what happens at the end of this by the end of this 4 years. And also we need to be thinking about an intersectional approach and thinking about how, we know that race is the greatest predictor of environmental risks and harms across a whole set of sectors. But we also know that, if folks are multiply marginalized, that they're more at risk. So, people with disabilities, LGBTQ folks, poor people, and people with disabilities who are also people of color, et cetera. Like where you layer marginalization, you also have the potential for compounding risks and harms. And we need to kind of understand people as whole people and understand that kind of our traditional notion of EJ populations as being geographically based is true, and also that sometimes you have dispersed populations that are also at risk in different ways. And finally, I just want to come back to this question of self-determination and how do we bring back that principle that has been consistent and a through line in the movement, but has never really made it into policy, so that we're shifting and sharing power and resources. So that's that is my kind of, look to the past in order to look towards the present. What are we calling it? Reflection and inspiration, I hope inspiration. And I want to sort of take this back into the questions of, where are the examples where just transition has happened in policy and policy implementation. And I will say that we are still working on that. And it's really hard. I was working with a community, City of Holyoke, when I was at CLF, where the City of Holyoke and an organization called Grassroots, community-based, people of color-led organization called Neighbor to Neighbor, got resources to do an energy transition plan. And they have a particular opportunity in Holyoke. They have recently, over the past 10 or so years, shifted from coal to solar in a pretty transformative way. They have a municipal utility that has incorporated hydro, both I think small scale hydro, but also sort of the more problematic larger scale hydro. They're looking at a kind of, looking ahead and looking for opportunities to increase renewables. And the community actually said, we actually want to create a process where the city and the community are kind of co-equal in this. And they received funding from the Barr Foundation to do this. If we have community and policymakers as kind of co-equal decision makers, and they asked CLF to look for governance structures that would support that. And they were hard to find. I think the two best examples I could come up with were at the local level. One is, I keep pointing to the City of Providence climate justice planning process, which was really rooted in kind of a racial justice advisory that has been kind of built up in the community that's very strong. And that, so I would read their climate justice plan as one example, which is very much rooted in the history. It's very much rooted in the voices of the people most affected, and also and provide some guiding principles for moving forward. I think looking to the California Air Resources, the Bay, not CARB, but the Bay Area Air Quality Management District has had some really good examples, particularly in West Oakland, where you have a governance structure where community is very much at the center. I think we're all watching New York and New Jersey, and I can send links to, yes, I can send links to things as a follow-up for sure. We're all looking at New York and New Jersey. New York in the implementation of the CLCPA, the Community Leadership and Climate Protection Act, which has really, like your GWSA, really built in a kind of robust advisory structure, but also some really kind of guiding language in the statute around air quality, pollution reductions, and also the shifting of resources to not just BIPOC communities, but also labor who is affected by this transition. And then the New Jersey new EJ legislation, which has built in into its permitting an analysis of cumulative impacts, but also a mandate that their New Jersey DEP actually prohibit projects from moving forward where they have cumulative impacts on a community, which is not necessarily analogous to the GWSA in a direct way, but they are really workshopping this idea: how do you put cumulative impacts into effect in a way that has teeth and really protects communities? And I think so. Those are two places where I will definitely be looking. I think the California example has been iterative, and I think that the question of how there's some really important lessons to learn about kind of what not to do in terms of marginalized folks over time, and really important lessons from EJ leaders themselves, the EJ movement itself, about what they are asking for, and then also what it means to kind of keep shifting and changing in response to that feedback, including through the dedication of resources in ways that directly help communities. So those are some places where I'm certainly watching this process. I'm also watching the evolution of the TCI process and the response of the environmental movement to EJ, EJ, I would say, demands for folks to show up and be in solidarity. And that the Georgetown Climate Center, and I think the states who are signing on are now kind of realizing they need to sit down and have more of a dialogue. In terms of this question of a win-win policy, I think it's not always going to be win-win, but I think we really have to have a different definition of cost benefit. We have to have a different definition, and I'm actually in the process of working with my students to write comments to the Federal Office of Management and Budget. How do you engage in an equity analysis? How do you incorporate that into your cost benefit? How do you, how do you bring in to that cost benefit the gains of, public health benefits for communities where you're ratcheting down pollution, for example? How do you factor in kind of cost over time to communities that have been marginalized out of a process? And thinking about, different kinds of wins and different kinds of losses when we have often thought about them in very economic terms. And we've often thought about the wins in terms of the voices that are the loudest, and not necessarily factored the wins for the voices who have been historically marginalized. So with that, I'm happy to, that's a lot of me talking, but so I will stop, and hopefully that is helpful, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Amy, thank you so much. Let's do a little conversation with Amy about this. Questions that it raises for you, thoughts, reactions from you on the council. Feel free to raise your hands, or if you're having a hard time with that, just open up your mic and shout out. what does this spark for you in the thinking of the work that we have to do? Chad, go ahead, please.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Amy, thank you very much. That was highly informative. So in the news, I think it was maybe 3 weeks ago, news out of the state of Maine, the legislature passed a bill for the governor's signature that would require the Public Utility Commission over there to consider climate in addition to cost and reliability and all the other things that, you know, a public utility needs to rule on. And not surprisingly, the state of Maine had followed the state of Massachusetts example there. And Massachusetts took it one step further, and their PUC is now required to not only consider climate, but consider equity and environmental justice in their rulings. Could you talk a little bit about, if you've seen that, can you talk a little bit about how that could, if that could be beneficial here in Vermont, and you know, what legislation like that can do to further the environmental justice and equity issues that, you know, I think sort of provide an umbrella for what you were talking about.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I should have brought that up as an example, and there's so much in the 2050 roadmap bill in Massachusetts, that the omnibus bill that was passed earlier this year, that I sometimes forget that piece of it. So I think, you know, there are different ways in which that the climate analysis and the equity analysis come up, and both for in Massachusetts, the Energy Facilities Siting Board and the Department of Public Utilities, which, you know, the EFSB is sort of nested in the DPU. And I would say I have had a limited set of firsthand experiences working in that context, but enough to believe that this will make a difference, and enough to sort of see what happens when you're not, that the failure to incorporate climate impacts and the failure to incorporate equity has actually had a detrimental effect. And in fact, you know, even in the decision-making around the Mass Save program, which is the energy efficiency program that comes out of RGGI, the decision-making around the, you know, the sort of equity analysis of that program, which basically, for folks who don't know Mass Save, it's administered by the utilities. The utilities, it actually, there is a DPU docket, and the utilities submit plans for their energy efficiency programs, and then it gets a, you know, there's a public process prior. Communities can weigh in over time, and then you can participate in the docket, and CLF has over many years participated in the docket. And even in that analysis, you know, the ratepayers are sort of at the center of that in terms of the kind of equity considerations, but the broader considerations of how we, you know, how the money is distributed it's not, the DPU has been constrained from fully evaluating that question. But the DPU has also been constrained from fully evaluating questions around the benefits of fuel switching. And so, you know, the question of cost, and particularly cost to ratepayers, when, you know, there's an opportunity to incentivize kind of gas to electric, which also could potentially have some significant health benefits, that has been left out of the equation. So, you know, as one really stark example, I think, you know, in the other example that I have had firsthand experience with is the siting of a substation in substation and transmission lines in East Boston and Chelsea, which are two very overburdened environmental justice communities that are majority Spanish speaking. My experience with that has been more on the language access side of things, where we've had to hold EFSB accountable for civil rights violations. But what we also saw was, you know, the community trying to fight the placement of the substation, and there some real issues around whether that substation was needed, and and whether there were any specific benefits to the community that would have to deal with that, that one more facility on top of another. When in fact, what we were looking at was old that was needed a little, and definitely nothing to say that the community itself would benefit, but would in fact be burdened. So I think there's, those are some specific examples where we needed those tools. I think, the number of places where those considerations really need to be built in are far vaster than that. But I'd rather talk from my experience and say this is where we see the gaps.
Thanks.
Sure, really good question. Thank you.
So are there other things that it's sparking amongst you all as you think about the next steps you all have as a council in incorporating equity and just transitions? Abby, and then Secretary Moore.
We've had a lot of questions in our subcommittee, particularly around solar and the life cycle assessment of that. Where is lithium being sourced, et cetera, where the impact, if we're converting to solar here, what are the impacts that that's having in communities elsewhere? How do we make sure that our decisions here aren't pushing that off elsewhere? I apologize, I still haven't had a chance to listen to the Just Transitions workshop. So potentially this was already discussed, but I'm just sort of wondering how we can address the concerns of BIPOC folks within this process as it already exists in questions like that, and make sure that we are honoring those questions appropriately. And I don't have the answers, so looking for some guidance in that regard as to how to balance those factors.
I think that I will say that I don't think that anyone has a good answer to that yet. That is, nobody has a good, easy answer. There is not a good, easy answer to that. So I think one thing that I will just say from, my opinion would be the starting place is transparency around impacts, and really, it may not be that in your policy in your sort of mandated policy analysis that you need to take into those accounts, but the willingness to be to account for them in your analysis, even if it's not in your decision making, would be a good place to start. So, and this is not just in solar. This is, this is about the transition to zero emission vehicles. This is also about reliance on, Quebec hydro, which was a really big conversation in Massachusetts and Maine around, the recent, the recent still in progress transmission project was, what does it mean to rely on big hydro that has had a really devastating effect on Indigenous communities in Canada, and that we don't actually have the jurisdiction. There's no place that we have found where we can really adequately account for that in state or federal policy, even if we wanted to. And so, some of that, so I would say starting with that level of, transparency and analysis, and, surfacing that gives you an opportunity to make different choices if there are different choices to be made, but at least being clear about the risks involved in your choices. I think there's, the more we're able to practice that, the more we might decide we're going to make different decisions that are about more hyper-local decision, hyper-local solutions. But I would say if Vermont can be in the lead on that, you will be an example for the rest of us.
Thanks, Amy. Secretary Moore.
My question's actually about balance too, but in a bit of a different space. I really appreciated your comments, Amy Laura. And as I'm sure you're aware, the climate bill has a really aggressive timeline associated with it. And I guess I'm just interested in sort of your thoughts on how we balance the need for rapid adoption and transition against the fact that in doing the hard work to reach out to, I guess to say hard and intentional work to reach out to marginalized and underserved communities, we have to first start by building a relationship. And that takes time, and there's no way to rush that. And so I guess I'm wondering about, do you feel like transparency is really the key in that space too, in terms of how we present what our timeline is and what we're going to be able to do by when? I'm always concerned that it's just going to feel like lip service, so to speak, if we are unable to fully engage these communities in a robust process, and would be interested in your thoughts and feedback.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I got most of
Is she still here?
Yeah.
I think
I
she
think
don't.
she's breaking
Amy's
up.
internet is a little bit spotty, unfortunately. Amy, we lost you just for a second here.
Maybe if the video goes up, there we
Can you
go.
hear me?
Yeah, maybe without video for a little bit might salvage that. Thanks.
All right. Does this work?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. So, so I'm gonna just be the person. I'm not part of this process, so I'm just gonna be the person who suggests the thing that you probably don't want to hear, which is slow down. And figure out a way to work with the legislature to be, you know,
Shoot. Amy, we're having a real hard time with your internet right now, unfortunately. So it's hard to hear, even with your camera off, unfortunately. Normally, I would say if you want to call in with the phone, switch to phone, but we're sort of right at the edge of time too. But I would welcome you, I would think if the internet continues to do what it's doing, to switch to phone audio. But you want to try one more time here, Amy, so we can hear you? Shoot. Okay, so well, Amy, if you can hear us, oh, it looks like we just lost her. I would suggest you switch to phone audio. Peter, I wonder, in addition to making a question to Amy, if you wanted to make a comment. Peter, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think I just wanted to follow up a little bit for the council as a whole, as one of Vermont's board members for Reggie, the TCI person for the state, lead TCI person for the state. She provided the example of market-based solutions as where concerns have been. I would just expand that to say any policy that we develop that doesn't think about the knock-on ramifications of things is going to end up with equity concerns. And so as we center equity in our discussion, we avoid some of those potential challenges. Reggie led to some siting issues that, because we didn't have appropriate siting considerations in each follow-on state and rules around the co-pollutants that were really of concern to those communities, it caused issues. So it wasn't the greenhouse gas actions that necessarily were causing those challenges. It was because we didn't, the thought through of the rest of the pieces didn't happen. The TCI piece, Amy, Laura, is absolutely accurate. There wasn't enough engagement early on. That process has improved. I think part of the challenge, and this is something for us to consider, is that it's sort of, a lot of it is sort of what you do with the resources from that process. And that's a state by state decision. And so having that conversation at a regional level is complicated because each of the states can't kind of agree to do things that their legislature ultimately has control of. That doesn't make it any less important to have those conversations. And so it just is a way of sort of expanding it to say any policy we consider, if we don't figure out what it's going to mean and figure out ways to address it, we can run into some of these challenges. So I appreciate, Amy, Laura, your comments. I just wanted to sort of provide that context, and I'm happy to go in deeper with anybody who would like it on any of those topics.
Thanks, Peter. And Amy, I see you're back. And We need to wrap it up here. Amy, Laura, any last word from you? I mean, we're super appreciative for you taking the time like this to be with us. Any final words from you?
My final word, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay. My final word was going to be the, what I was trying to say when I was breaking up was I was going to be the unpopular voice of slow down. And if there's a way to do that, if there's a way to find a compromise solution around slowing down, I think that that's actually that has helped with TCI. I think the willingness to do that demonstrates, really demonstrates, the commitment to partnership and relationship. And I have been paying attention because I came into this process, I came to VLS in February, but also had, through CLF had been seeing kind of, the short timeline and the short timeline to do a lot of really ambitious things. And sometimes that does, and that urgency, even in the context of the climate crisis, and even where we know we need to get somewhere fast, can be very detrimental in the long run. And so that if what I do is come to you and be that person who says, like, can you just take an extra 6 months? Sometimes that extra 6 months will make an enormous amount of difference. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate it. Okay. So that is a natural pivot from, and Amy, Laura, you're welcome to stay with us, or you're welcome to drop off as you wish. We're going to talk a little bit more about just transitions right now. So if you have some time to stay around, that's probably great. But we do liberate you if you have other things you need to do with your day. Okay. So this is a pivot to our next conversation, which Jane's going to lead off around supporting subcommittees with implementing just transitions principles. I'm not going to say anything more and just let Jane take it away. So Jane, if you are there and want to tee up this conversation, I'll turn it over to you.
Morning, everybody. Yep. Hold on. Let me...
Morning.
Yeah. Slowly but surely. Okay, morning, everybody. I wanted to first revisit this image that I shared with you at our last full council meeting back in May, and remind you, which David did too at the beginning as he introduced Amy Laura this morning, that we made a commitment as a council at the last meeting to a three-pronged approach to our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We discussed this concept of holding space at the beginning of every council meeting to revisit how environmental justice plays into the work of the council with respect to how we're moving towards the development of the climate action plan, as well as ultimately the implementation. We also spoke about our engagement work and have been continuously as a council and within the subcommittees right now in our process around using a method more around co-creation and thinking about how we involve the public from the onset of the inception of the development of our strategies and recommendations all the way through the implementation, rather than doing what traditionally is done with the state, which is put out a plan or put out our strategies and recommendations and hope that the public will react to it and we will accommodate their reactions. In this space, we're trying to take time and think about how we work together to develop the climate action plan. The third component was this idea around a recognition and understanding of the organization that is the Climate Council and subcommittees, and how we could do better within the structure of the Climate Council and subcommittees in recognizing and appreciating diversity, equity, and inclusion work. To that end, both with the steering committee and here at the council, I've mentioned that we went out at the suggestion of our consultant who we're working on an engagement work, Rise Consulting, and reached out specifically to an organization called the Rowan Institute to put together a proposal to think about what we as a council and subcommittee could do in lifting up the diversity, equity, and inclusion work in this space. The proposal was big and comprehensive and perhaps more than what we can do with respect to our capacity and time at this moment. However, the first component of that proposal was very much in line with the space and the moment in time that we are in right now with respect to the development and sort of birthing of the guiding principles and scoring rubric. So what I'd like to propose today is thinking about one component relative to the work and where we are right now and how we move forward with support of the guiding principles and the scoring rubric in this space. There's been both the rollout within the subcommittees. Many of the subcommittees have followed up from the workshop last week and had dialogue about what they like about the guiding principles and the challenges about actual implementation of the scoring rubric itself. I just want to lead with this comment that I think really resonated for many of us that came out of the workshop, which was my summary. In the abstract, the rubric seems theoretical and overwhelming. Applying the questions to specific program design and contrast felt productive and important. I think that's really true, and we'd like to find an ability to think about when in the process that moment in time is most productive, recognizing that our conversation later today that David will lead around the engineering of the climate action plan and the right levels, the equity work is just one component of all of the things we're trying to think about and balance as we develop strategies and recommendations. So when is the right time to really use something like a scoring rubric, as well as operationalize the guiding principles themselves? And how can we do that objectively and consistently across the subcommittees? So what I'd like to propose, and what we talked about with the steering committee last week, was the idea of supporting the facilitated application of these tools. And we've been thinking about doing this perhaps by working with the Just Transition Subcommittee to put together a scope of work that we could go out to bid on that would be targeted specifically on the application of the scoring rubric later on in the process. So we're thinking about the best time for this is really later on in late August, early September, when we're sort of synthesizing the engagement that we heard over the summer. The technical analysis work is coming back in. We've already tested a broad suite of strategies, and we're thinking about how those final bucket of strategies are going to be implemented in the climate action plan through that finer specificity that we don't quite have yet. So we're thinking about the idea now of putting together that scope of work with the Just Transition Subcommittee, as I mentioned. We're recognizing that there are individuals in Vermont who have this expertise and are familiar with this process, so that if we put a scope of work out to bid on, that there are a number of candidates that we could think about who could help us with this process. And so I'm really excited about this idea and really feel like it is what we need right now around that organizational support for the guiding principles and the scoring rubric. And the big takeaway is that, yes, that we could get support on board to help us with this, but a recognition also that right now, as the subcommittees put together their strategies for the council meeting in July, that this will mean that you'll just sort of have to struggle through it for now on your own and use the guiding principles to the best of your ability to spark dialogue and recognize any blind spots out of the gate. But hopefully, this will lead to a productive conversation within the subcommittees that will ultimately be sort of brought to conclusion or further down the line later in the fall if we're able to advance something like this that we're seeing as a need right now. So I wanted to recognize that there's a lot of ways that we could go with organizational analysis. There are other components that we'll be thinking about over the next few weeks and months about how we enhance our DEI work within the Climate Council subcommittees. But this particular component feels the most timely right now with all of us who've been considering this. And I wanted to put this out as a placeholder to also spark conversation about what other folks are feeling after they've participated in the workshop that Just Transitions put out there. What other needs that you feel are out there with respect to this work? And is this the primary sort of what's rising to the top for you with respect to how we advance this work? So I'll pause there, and David, please feel free to follow up and welcome questions and comments.
No, that's great. Thanks, Jane, so much. So one of the, we tested this in the steering committee last week. And so I welcome steering committee members to chime in with some of the reactions you had to this thought last week and other members. essentially what we're saying is the highest value support we can provide right now to subcommittees and the council around just transitions is to help in applying the guiding principles, the draft guiding principles, and those draft questions, and which are in this scoring rubric right now. And it's not going to happen in July. Just Transitions committee members, subcommittee members will be joining and have been joining the other subcommittees to help in July. However, it will happen in August and into September if this seems like the path you'd like to take. So let me just pause, and if folks from the steering committee and or others who want to weigh in with some reactions to this idea or just a full thumbs up to Jane, go forth, make this happen. Sounds great. So what are folks' reactions to what Jane's putting out there? Yeah, and obviously, Joy, Just Transitions co-chairs, please feel free to chime in too. Sue?
Well, I can just say that I wanted to appreciate, I guess, a lot of work that has gone on, obviously in the subcommittee of the Just Transitions, but in all of the subcommittees, and that it is hard work, and that, you know, it isn't something we can rush through quickly, you know, to all the comments made earlier, but also that, you know, at some point, I think we had this concept that, gee, you know, the members of our subcommittee could just join your subcommittees and figure it out. And we really recognize these are difficult things that no one member of a subcommittee can necessarily have the expertise and time, frankly, to dig in the way that I think is required of us. So I personally really love the idea, support the idea that Jane has presented, that we think strategically about who and how to do that, and not rush to try to do it right now, but to be moving forward through your July timeframe with, you know, what we've put in the forefront, and that it is again centering the equity at the lens of our work. And it, I think, hopefully will help us understand a lot more than it might otherwise, but not that we're trying to score or put, you know, some ideas above others at this point when we're really still in the process. So anyway, that is my probably too lengthy way of saying I like this idea. I think it will help all of us, but also recognizing that our subcommittee isn't the expert that you need to take you through that.
Thanks, Sue. Chad, was that a hand that you wanted to raise, or is that an accidental hand? Okay. Okay.
Just trying to give a thumbs up.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, yeah.
See the
Great.
reaction here. Sorry.
It's all good. Okay. Chris?
I'll just note, I think the bandwidth, I think it's a good approach. I think the bandwidth of having the subcommittee members, the Just Transition subcommittee members kind of help shepherd this. We've got limitations. I know for me, and I'm not complaining, but some weeks I'm in climate council meetings for like 10 plus hours. And I've got some capacity to do that. A lot of other people don't. But we're going to have to transition from just a totally volunteer based effort on this to having some other additional support, I think. So
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. I bet that sentiment is shared by many. Yeah. I saw some head nodding. Okay. Any other feedback for Jane on this? I'll just reiterate what I heard last week when we talked about this in the steering committee. One was, sounds great, very exciting to have the idea of some consistent analysis and consistent facilitation across the subcommittees on this work, and that sounds really wonderful. Two, the scoring rubric today is best thought of as sparking a set of questions rather than creating a sense of real numeric outcomes that can be comparable across different types of recommendations. So use it as a sense of questions more than getting to a number. Also because of the issue of, you know, not all questions are necessarily equal. And third, there could be some challenges in bringing some whole new voice or whole new consultant into this process. So if there is a way to privilege folks who have some familiarity with what's going on here or have been involved one with the other, so much the better, right? Because, you know, there's a lot of folks involved already. Adding new folks in can have its challenges. So those are some 3 big points that I heard from last week's conversation. I'll just open it up one last time. Anybody else has anything else they want to say before we take this as an approval from you all as a council saying, go forth and do this, please. Anything else before we take that?
David, I just put in chat a question to Sue, because I was in some of the subcommittee meetings where they were discussing the just transitions principles and the use of the rubric. I mean, Sue, I think the co-chairs met after steering committee. Do the co-chairs agree with that characterization that David just shared of the rubric as being primarily a tool or lens as opposed to an actual ranking?
Yes, I think that is where we're at. And I was just writing in the chat as well that if you look at the principles at the end of the document, there are guiding questions. And the rubric really follows and is in synchronized essentially with those questions. And it may, in my opinion, be easier at this moment to be asking the questions of your subcommittee when you think about these strategies, rather than at this point scoring or comparing. But, you know, some people like the specific questions, you know, people learn and think differently. So those are both tools to at this point be using as ways of thinking about. And that's where I think we are appropriately in the process at this time. That would be my opinion. Please chime in. And I know Sarah is here as well.
Sarah, we can't hear you. I think you have a double mute on.
I did the double mute. Thanks, David. Yeah, I agree. I think I was just typing in the chat box as Sue was talking, just to say that, again, we were just, again, I think trying to, people have different ways of learning and processing. And so the two are really just 2 different tools to kind of help get at the same thing. So yeah, I think ultimately how that rubric or how a more quantitative approach is integrated into the decision-making is something that the council needs to discuss, and maybe feeds into your next part of the agenda today, David.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I'll just make a quick note. If we are using the chat, it's best to say use chat to all panelists and attendees. That way everybody who's observing can see the chat as well. So thanks. I know it's a little confusing sometimes. Okay, good. All right, anything else before we give Jane the green light to go forth on this and get the help lined up? Anything else? Joey, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, it sort of applies more broadly. I'm fully supportive of this. I think it makes a lot of sense. So my comment maybe applies a little bit more broadly, which is, you know, what Amy Laura's presentation and like overview was super helpful. This is all interconnected with so many different things. She talked briefly about a push for a complementary policy. I'm curious, you know, what are the recommendations that we are making in service of the statute and our charge? And then what other things can we be identifying as needs or complementary approaches that are going to take us down this road? So I guess I'm just curious. I want people to be thinking about, I mean, this is all connected. You know, we've essentially built our economy like on a like crumbling pile of bricks. We need to shift. So like we need a massive overhaul. Like, so I just want to make sure that there's space to identify those things that are directly within our purview and other things, complementary policies or approaches that we should be urging.
Thanks, Joey. I don't know if, you know, Secretary Moore or someone else would want to comment on that. I think, you know, I assume you as the Climate Council can say a whole bunch of different things that you'd want to say, as long as you do the things that you're also required to do in the statute. But I don't know, Julie or someone else want to make a comment on that.
I would defer to Suzanne if she'd like to, but I'm also happy to share thoughts.
Sure.
Go ahead, Julie.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, David. The GWSA, to my mind, the statute sets the minimum. And I think there are opportunities to go above and beyond what's required there. That said, we have to make sure we do address all of the elements contained within the act. And I know that there's varying levels of detail around some of them, and getting to a sense of how to consistently address and provide feedback to the legislature and to the greater Vermont community is one of the pieces that Jane and I routinely talk about in our check-ins.
So I think that's a good pivot to two things. One, we're going to pause and take some public comment now. And two, after we get back from a break, we are going to look at the sort of how we pull this plan together in a level of detail and that kind of conversation we're going to have. So I want to, Joey, that comment you made, I think is particularly relevant when we go to that next conversation after the break. So I want to keep it alive when we get back from the break as well. Okay, so just to put a pin in it, to be very clear, I am hearing a willingness from all of you as a council to go forth with what Jane's suggesting in terms of that level of support. So unless I hear somebody shout out otherwise right now, let's assume that you all are saying yes to that. But let me pause. Can anybody not live with that? Great. Okay, wonderful. All right, let's take some public comment on these issues. And then we'll take a break and come back and do a little more work. So members of the public, if you're joining us and you'd like to make a comment, please use the hand raised function in Zoom. And this is an opportunity to chime in on these issues of just transitions and equity that we've been wrestling with this morning so far. So let me just give you all a moment. If you'd like to make a comment on these issues, go ahead and raise your hand in the Zoom world, and we'll get you up and promote you as a panelist to speak. I'll just give a moment if anybody would like to make a comment at this time. Okay. I'm not seeing members of the public wanting to comment at this time. We'll have additional opportunity for public comment at the end of the meeting. So thanks, everyone. Okay, so why don't we do this? Why don't we take a break and we'll come back in, let me just look at my agenda real quick when we thought we'd come back. Why don't we come back in 10 minutes, so a little bit, 10, 12 kind of thing. Take a break, go get some coffee, stretch, do your email, whatever you got to do. We'll be back at 10:12. And we'll get going again on this next conversation. So thanks everyone for hanging in there this morning. We'll see you in 10 minutes time. Okay, go ahead and put yourself on mute or turn off your camera, and we'll see you in just a moment. Okay, great. All right, so with the steering committee, with Jane, we've been trying to do some thinking about, additional thinking about what the climate action plan will look like and needs to look like in the initial version of it that's going to have to be written in the fall and ready for December 1st. And the reason we've been doing that thinking is because we're all going to be moving fairly quickly at that point. And we want to make sure that the work that's happening now is as oriented as possible to the plan that we're assuming we'll be able to do the initial draft plan on December 1st. And that means thinking about the outline, which we've already done. And remember, we've shared that outline and talked a little bit about it, and we got good feedback from you all on it. It also means thinking about what I call the right altitude, right? The right altitude means the level of detail, the amount of information that we have in the draft, in the initial, climate action plan. And then any additional information that we have that we want to have as supplementary material and annexes or other things like that. And so we've done a little more thinking about it. We want to share that thinking with you and get your feedback on it to see if we're on the same page, because it's such a critical time for the subcommittees as you all in your subcommittees are trying to prepare recommendations that you'll share with with you all, with yourselves, with the full council here in late July. Okay, let me just lay out some thinking we've done, and then let's get some reactions from you all on it and see where it takes us in terms of trying to align our own set of expectations about what this climate action plan, this initial climate action plan, is going to look like. All right, so here we go. Okay, we're calling this Assembling the Climate Action Plan. And this is the same outline we've spoken about before, but we're trying to provide it in a way that gets us thinking about level of detail and what that means and how we're going to be potentially consolidating and or what some people would call prioritizing information in that plan. So as we've spoken about before, the initial climate action plan is going to have 3 buckets of recommendations that correspond to the work that's being asked of you by the Global Warming Solutions Act. The first bucket is about emissions reductions or mitigation. The second bucket is about sequestration. And the third, although the order is not set in stone at all, is about the resilience and adaptations recommendations, okay? So each of these 3 buckets are important pieces of work that you all are working very hard on in your subcommittees. They are roughly corresponding to the way the subcommittees are set up, but we know that the outputs of the subcommittees are going to cross across these buckets a little bit. So there's going to be some resorting as we develop the initial plan. Each of these buckets are going to need at least and primarily 3 sections, right? And the first of those 3 pieces we're going to need for each of these folks, so for the mitigation recommendations, the sequestration, and the resilience pieces, we're going to need something that speaks to where are we headed as a state. And we're calling this right now goals and performance metrics. And as you'll see in that little footnote at the bottom of the slide there, for the emissions reductions pieces, mitigation piece, this is spelled out in statute, right? So you have a set of goals on emissions reductions that are spelled out in statute. You're not reinventing those, they're there, right? For resilience and for sequestration, it's not as spelled out in statute. And this is an interesting thing for you as subcommittees to recognize, is you have an opportunity here to really lay out some clearer vision about where you're headed and where the state is headed, right? So in addition to recommendations, you're setting out this vision and these performance metrics to say, are we getting to where we want to go? And we can talk a little bit about, in a moment, about if those subcommittees are working on that, you're not working on that, and would it be helpful to get some thoughts around this? Okay. The second 2 pieces are these sections that we'll need in each of the buckets. One is recommendations that are ready to go, right? Ready for immediate implementation, go into rulemaking, here we go, we're ready to go, okay? And then there's going to be a section around recommendations that are important ideas that are emerging from the subcommittee work and need additional development, okay? The ready to go pieces, the immediate implementation, will likely have a little more detail about what that implementation might look like, right? The ones that are requiring more development will likely have a little less detail about sort of the specificity of what implementation looks like, okay? As a quick note, for emissions reductions, for mitigation, you need to have the immediate implementation recommendations need to add up, right, to the 2025 emissions reduction targets in the 2030, right? So for the mitigation piece, this middle piece around immediate implementation, those numbers do need to add up. Okay, and then the final piece we wanted to mention here is about sort of key criteria. And here, it's this sort of, I know that some groups are working on multi-criteria decision tools and analysis tools, and that's really exciting. I think what we're saying here, more than everybody needs to have a multi-criteria decision tool, is for each of these buckets, you're going to need to tell a story about these types of criteria. You need to tell a story about how they together push you towards the goals that you're laying out, whether it's emissions reductions or the goals that, or performance metrics that you're setting up for sequestration and resilience and adaptation. Right? They need to speak about these other 4 components too: cost effectiveness and other economic analysis, feasibility, all this equity work we're talking about right now that we spent the morning on. And then what we've spoken about with Jane and the team as well is a specific shout out to recommendations that provide multiple benefits, right? Mitigation recommendations that also are resilience recommendations, and vice versa, and sequestration, et cetera. Okay, and other types of co-benefits such as air quality improvement, you name it, health co-benefits. Okay, so why are we offering this framework now? One, we think it's helpful to get going on this because the fall is honestly right around the corner. And 2, we want to get your input on it to see if we're in the right zone, and see how it makes you might think perhaps a little differently about the task ahead with your subcommittees towards the end of July and then beyond in August, September. And so we want to avoid any kind of wheel spinning that might happen at the subcommittee level, because that would be truly frustrating for everybody. Okay, so this is what we wanted to share. I'm going to drop my screen just for a second, but I can always bring it back up to share. And I had a couple questions for you to kick it off. But before I pose those questions, I see a hand from Richard. So Richard, go ahead, please.
Well, it may be that you're going to ask the question. So I wanted to just chime in briefly with 2 comments. The first is that the list of criteria that on the right-hand side of the screen, to me, seem very good. Those are all things that we need to work through as we propose any of the major elements of the plan, for sure. My second comment goes to the concept of immediate implementation. It's going to become apparent that a number of the actions that are really needed to meet the goals of the statute would require, highly likely to require, legislative action. And so, you did mention ready for action, ready to go to rulemaking, et cetera. There may be some of those, but it's also quite likely that what the council is going to have to do is recommend legislative action. If that's comprehended in the definition of immediate action, then we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, excellent, Richard. We are saying the same thing. And I mentioned rulemaking, but I also meant to say in the same breath, it's ready for legislative action if that's the next step on that recommendation. So absolutely saying the same thing. Thank you. I'm seeing hands come up, and I'll just, before I jump to you, Sue, I'll say my questions were, Richard already anticipated one of them. How do those criteria feel on the right-hand side? I can pull up the slide, we can look at them again. That was definitely one of my questions. Another was, what other information might you need now in your subcommittees around this, the way we're thinking about developing the report, so that you feel like you're, nobody's heading down the wrong path here in the subcommittee work, everybody's aligned on it. So is there additional information you need? So those are 2 of my questions. Sue, I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, but I just wanted to put those out there. Go ahead, Sue, please.
I'm sorry that I'm not sure I'm answering your question, so I can hold. It's more a comment.
Go ahead. It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. Well, I found your presentation very helpful, and in particular with respect to just transitions and some of the question in particular that Secretary Moore raised and that the speaker responded, that we need to slow down this really important challenge of the timing expected of us, this ambitious expectation, and yet the all concurrent demand to have real engagement and thoughtful engagement, and that those 2 really don't work together. But if what I like about your presentation is that we think about things that have to happen on a very quick timeline to meet the urgency of climate and the statutory requirements of emission reductions on a quick timeline by 2025, but also the recognition that that's just one phase of this, and that our work and our engagement and our processing will need to continue to evolve. And so for me, that's very helpful and important to both move forward with expeditious action in the most critical areas and to continue to engage and evolve in those areas that have longer term changes. I mean, Joey mentioned, kind of a massive change that's potentially needed. And certainly that doesn't happen by December or March. So I just want to say that for me and the role that we're trying to play with meaningful engagement and yet also urgent action, at least on some of the most critical needs, is a helpful framing that I hope others will feel helps to be engaged in this difficult dance.
Thanks, Sue. That's really helpful. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I just the thing that jumped out at me is as maybe missing, and really appreciate this framework. It's super helpful. Is the evaluation of existing programs and strategies and how we integrate that into this work. I know part of that happens by having a business as usual base case that we're able to measure against, to understand what gains we've already made through the programs we have in place. But looking at both modifications to make those programs more effective, but I think probably more importantly, some of the equity considerations that may not have been part of the initial program design are really important. And just wondering if you have thoughts about the timing of that work. I know there's so many moving pieces right now, but that existing program inventory is a pretty important component. And it's not completely clear to me how it fits in that construct.
Thanks, Secretary Moore. Indeed, it's not explicitly called out. I'd welcome people's reactions to that. I will say my immediate reaction when I hear that is when we talk about recommendations, I think part of it is a recommendation of something new or a recommendation of changing an existing policy that needs to be updated for a variety of reasons, whether it's an equity consideration or some other. So I think it's encompassing of that. And I know that in the work plans of many, if not all subcommittees, was this look across what exists. So if that's not happening, that clearly is something that would be helpful from the subcommittees. I know Jane's been more attuned to all the conversations that are going on. Jane, you have your hand up, so this is a good pivot to you. I don't know if you want to speak to that issue and whatever else you were hoping to speak to.
Yes, I'm happy to speak to that issue first and just say that the subcommittees and everybody else can speak to this too. I've been handling it slightly differently, but in rural resilience in particular, I feel like they have really had a focus of having a task group focused on looking at the inventory that was put together for the initial presentation to the Climate Council early in the process, and have put together a quite comprehensive list of programs, both largely in state government, but also thinking outside of state government, that address resiliency and adaptation components, and are using that as the basis as they move into their more substantive development of strategies and recommendations to think about how they reinvest and re-envision some of the existing programs, and have also thought about how they incorporate equity components to enhance those programs going forward. So it'd be great if Catherine and Erica want to speak to that task group in particular, because they really have done a nice job. And I think the intention is to hand it off to ag and ecosystems to build on, recognizing that oftentimes sequestration, resiliency, and adaptation programs all sort of are multiple benefits of the same program. So, and that was a timely tee up, because my original hand up was speaking largely to the sequestration and resiliency and adaptation work, and wanted to sort of lean into the component on your slide, David, that we have talked about at length around the development of a performance metric or goal for that component of the work. And I'd like to even sort of test the idea that right now is really of utmost importance for this first plan for that component of the work is getting there with sequestration and resiliency and adaptation. Like, what is the performance metric and the goal with respect to that work, and thinking about that high level vision and goal even more important at this point than maybe that finer detail that can come in future iterations. But I really hope that those subcommittees really lean into the development of what that could look like for their work over the coming months, so that in this first plan, that vision is set up for that bucket of work, and recognize that the refinement can be forthcoming if that takes more time than the detail of the strategies and recs that they might be very focused on right now. So I just wanted to raise that up, because it really, for the emissions reductions and mitigation strategies, we know what we're shooting for, but we don't with respect to those other components. And I think it's really important if we want a complete package that speaks to each other of what our climate work will look like for the state of Vermont. So.
Thanks, Jane. And that is an important piece. And I think for co-chairs of those two subcommittees, be interested to hear from that. Leslie Ann, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. I just wanted to offer up a compliment to all of the great discussion and all of the great framework that we just saw. In the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting last week, what we did was to discuss a proposal for a cross-cutting systems group that might look at some of the basic things that we're trying to bring together in the plan itself. And I'm not sure if you're seeing my screen okay, are you?
Could you put it in presenter mode?
Okay, not a problem.
Just to make it a little bigger.
Yeah. See that now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the last slide of that slide deck that's actually on the AOA website. And what we're trying to do is to think about some of the front pieces of the plan itself, where we're talking about all of the aspects of climate change and the various ways that we're looking at the effects of climate change going forward and what we're planning for. And so what I did is I just put together this little schematic here that tries to encapsulate some of the things that we're trying to think about in terms of using an equity-based lens to look at all of the various aspects of climate change, both in terms of the projections that we're trying to be looking at here, but also some of the moving pieces in looking at land use, land cover, looking at various aspects of resilience, looking at all of the governance and planning components, and then looking at some of the really, really specific core things of strategies and recommendations that we're putting forward. And as we're doing that, how are we trying to make sure that we're not missing any of the gaps that we've been talking about today and for the last few months or so, and then presenting a lot of that information through an equity-based lens in terms of visualizations and other types of data. So I just wanted to offer this up. It's, like I said, it's on the website. Marian, if you wouldn't mind just popping the link to that in the chat so folks have a direct link to it so that they can digest it, chew on it, and see some of these various pieces, which I know there's a lot chucked into here, but I just wanted to offer this, like I said, as a compliment.
Thanks, Leslie. And that's really interesting. And it also speaks when we talk about performance metrics and things like that, it seems like you all are doing some good thinking that would be supportive of understanding performance metrics that go beyond emissions reductions, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, trying to take a systems-based approach to this.
Okay. Super. All right. Well, that's really interesting. Are there other reactions to, I think that interesting where the data and science subcommittee is going seems very compelling and interesting, but are there other reactions as well to the overall sort of where this is going and what that means for your work as subcommittees? Are there pieces to this that are potentially not fully clear yet that it would be good to have a conversation about right now. TJ?
Hi, yeah. I just wanted to point out, I guess, on the right-hand side of that framework, one of the items was cost effectiveness. And the Science and Data Committee is going to be doing some work to help define what that is. And I just, in the context of really cost effective to whom? Is it to the participating customer? Is it to, Vermont as a whole? Is it to, broader society and how we value that, incorporating carbon and other co-benefits? And just, we're going to be doing some work on that, but it's probably not going to be with EFG and Cadmus, and it's probably not going to be ready by the time the initial recommendations are in the next month. But I just wanted to mention that so that as people were thinking about the initial policies that we'll all see this meeting next month, that we'll kind of have those frames, those different frames in mind.
That's great. It's really helpful. And I know, as we've said, and Jane's going to show a slide in a little bit too about milestones. It is a frustrating process that we're just going to get some economic analysis, in the fall as we're pulling things together. So we're going to have to make some assumptions about things this month and in July as we put some initial ideas on the table, and then really work in the fall to see how these different criteria play out in the ideas that we're developing, so that when we get to writing a climate action plan, and you all get to writing that with Jane's help, you're able to tell a story about these things that's clear, right? What does this mean in terms of an economic analysis or cost-effective analysis, right? What does this mean from an equity and just transitions perspective? Those are the stories that this climate action plan is going to have to speak to. And it's frustrating. You'll just have that analysis, September, early October. And with Marion's help, yes, Jane says. Okay, thanks, TJ. Other reactions to this in terms of how this is helping you think on the level of detail that we'll need to get to in this initial plan for December. I know we've gone back and forth a little bit on this. Abby, want to go ahead?
I'm just wanting to offer, we had a presentation on Friday from Chris Koliba at UVM around some of the work he's been doing on resilience and adaptation metrics from a community resilience perspective. And so maybe the council could listen into that, or maybe he's somebody that would be helpful to bring into the full council. But I found that to be really interesting, and I think helps sort of, it's still not quantifiable in the way that perhaps mitigation efforts are, but to Jane's point about, or I think it was Jane's point, creating the vision for what resilience and adaptation metrics look like forward, and what that looks like in a community resilience framework, I think is really helpful in understanding some of those more amorphous concepts as we move towards them.
That's great, Abby. And I'm glad to hear you say that. And I do think it's challenging for these two subcommittees, the Rural Resilience Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystem one, that you do have this additional task of needing to talk about a vision and talk about how you know if you're moving towards that vision, right? That's what performance metrics are essentially. Like, are we going in the right direction? So I want to test with the co-chairs, and Abby, I'm glad you spoke up. Like, does that, and as Jane asked, does that feel like something that you can move towards in the coming weeks to be able to put out that kind of vision in those potential performance metrics to know if you're moving in the direction you want to go?
I think, and Billy, please feel free to speak up, but based on the initial presentations we've had from our task group around ag emissions and the work that I've heard going on in other task groups, I do think we are headed in that direction. Visioning exercises have been components of, I'm not sure all, but most of the task groups. And so that really is how we're trying to think about this. What does a resilient regional climate adaptive food system in Vermont look like moving forward? What does that look like in the context of our natural and working lands, et cetera? So I think that we're on the right track, but obviously much more work to be done.
Thanks, Abby. Billy, I saw you turn your camera on. Do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with Abby and appreciate all your, the larger group thinking in this direction. I just timing wise, I think we're in the midst of compiling our initial recommended strategies. I think we'll probably need to complete that work before we can then kind of go back through those and orient them around particular goals or outcomes. But otherwise, I think this idea is a good one.
Great, thanks. Okay, other reactions to all this? Richard started us off saying those criteria on the right-hand side looked like the right ones. Let me just throw this up one more time, and we have a moment here to look at this. Just give me 1 second. I'll throw it back up. And apologies, this isn't linked to the agenda, but it'll be in the meeting materials, and we'll link it in the meeting materials. So these are criteria that have emerged in conversations with Jane and others and with co-chairs. If there are thoughts about additional criteria or framing some of these criteria differently, absolutely welcome it. And again, the spirit here is helping you all think through how you tell certain stories with the recommendations you're coming up with. And being able, and some people use the word prioritize, but that's not my favorite word. I would use it as, how are we making an analysis that allows us to say, yeah, we have something meaningful to say on these criteria, and that's going to naturally bubble up certain ideas more towards the top. Okay. Liz?
Thanks. Where on the right-hand side list would you put a funding discussion? It feels to me like it could fit in several of those buckets in terms of equity and justice, feasibility, probably others.
So funding absolutely has a component of equity. We've seen that in the work that the Just Transitions Group has done. It has a component around feasibility. And I don't know. I mean, I wonder, Jane, if you want to speak to that a little bit. I think getting to the level of funding is something that we would look to for the recommendations that are ready for more immediate action. Jane, do you have a thought about how funding should show up?
Well, I think it speaks a lot to cost effectiveness, and I do agree with Liz that it sort of has a component in all of the buckets. Yeah, I don't have an immediate reaction to, I guess, how it could fit standalone. I think that it warrants how like, I don't want to use the word, I was struggling not to use the word prioritization, but how a strategy becomes implementable has a lot to do with funding and the equity of that funding source. And so I think that it plays into the multiple buckets, but I should think a little bit more about where it speaks to specifically.
Thanks. Liz, do you want to follow up on any of that? Is that okay?
No, I mean, I just think that there have been other processes both here in Vermont and elsewhere where all of the good work in the world can be put in. And if the funding aspects are not really well addressed, then things don't happen. So I guess I'm just raising, as we look at this matrix, which I think is really good, how we can do everything we can to at least, recognize that possibility and avoid it to the extent possible by embedding it in our work.
Thanks, Liz. Okay. I'm seeing some more hands. Chris?
David, can you put that slide back up again?
You bet.
What I'm wondering is, it could relate to all of them, but maybe is there, in addition to the co-benefits, are there also the risks of not taking those actions? Because this is kind of the other side of what Liz was just talking about in terms of cost. There also the cost of not doing what we're saying, whether it's in the immediate term or longer term, because I think that's a piece that often gets lost, right? So I would need to think about it a little bit more, but it just feels like that's a potential piece that may be missing.
Thanks. Thanks. Abby?
I don't know if it's helpful, Liz. I believe we have been including funding within the feasibility portion of the when we're kind of analyzing things. That's where the funding has been going in how we've been looking at it so far. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how we've handled it thus far. And this is just an observational thing, but from a communication standpoint, or it's interesting that equity and justice and co-benefits are the last two on the list. And that's just an interesting thing to see in terms of thinking about the public and how they're perceiving this, or thinking about a co-created process. You know, the way that we literally write or put information out there does have meaning. And so what does it mean to the public when they see that those are below progress, cost effectiveness, and feasibility?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Boy, it'd be great to have a way of those not being in any sort of hierarchy, right? Secretary Young.
Thank you. I think Richard had his hand up long before me, so I'll let him go first.
Thanks. Richard.
Yeah, a quick comment. I think putting them more in a circular fashion rather than a list addresses Abby's point. I had the same kind of reaction to the list. These are all essential, equally essential criteria. And as for funding, I agree. We need to be responsible and think through how things could be paid for as part of, are they feasible? And that it would be I think it would not be consistent with the common sense Vermont approach to things if we just threw out great ideas without thinking about how in the heck are we going to administer them or pay for them.
Thanks, Richard. Secretary Young, and then Chris. I wasn't sure if that's a new hand or an old hand.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Just on the funding piece, I agree. We definitely are going to have to bring funding into the conversation. I feel like there might be some lessons learned from our journey through the Clean Water Act and implementing that over the years. And Secretary Moore well knows that we did a gap analysis at one point before we determined the funding stream for clean water and what was going to go into the Clean Water Fund and how much did we need every year. And maybe that's something that we're doing now. We're preparing inventories. We're looking at how well what we're doing is working. We're looking at whether we need to make changes. And then we're looking at new strategies. And at the end of the day, it feels like we're going to know where we have the gaps in funding, what might be available through the American Rescue Plan Act, as well as any future infrastructure bill. So I'm not saying we put off the conversation about funding, but I think it feels like the funding comes with finally developing the strategy and seeing where we have the gaps and other implementation now, and what funding we would need to implement further. So that's just my 2 cents and thinking about it that way.
Thanks, Secretary Young. So if I understood you well, you're saying it's a little bit sequential in that sense of developing strategies first and then weaving in the funding conversation more towards the back end of that. Is that what you're saying?
that's the way I felt it worked with the clean water. And granted, I came into that conversation a couple of years after the conversation started and right before the gap analysis occurred. But it felt like, you know, we knew what we needed to do in clean water, but we just had to really focus on where did we have the funding, where did we have the funding gaps, and again, if Secretary Moore has anything to add, you know, to how that worked and whether that's a model we could think about here, I'd welcome her thoughts.
Yeah, I'd add just a little bit to that. I think it's hard to start to talk about funding until we understand sort of the magnitude of what's going to need to be done, and appreciate that we may rebalance, and that's some of the work that happened in clean water, is we rebalanced our portfolio of work a little bit in response or in reflection on some of the funding streams that were available. But first you have to start by saying, okay, this is roughly the work that needs to be accomplished in each sector, and then you can tune it based on resources. But I think it's hard to sort of, I almost heard people describing something that felt like co-creating a funding model, right, with the program out of the gate. And I think there are challenges associated with that. And it also ties back into looking at some of the existing programs and what may be possible within those as well, with modifications to better serve our goals. So it's complicated and really intense work. And in the case of clean water, it took the better part of 18 months from when we had the sort of sector-based work completed to get through the full thinking about funding and financing.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, there was one more piece I wanted to test with folks on this, which is the climate action plan. The initial climate action plan will need to speak to a variety of audiences. And so when I use the word the right altitude, it spoke a little bit about this expectation of what really is the core content of that plan and how detailed is the plan itself as it tries to communicate to core audiences. And if there's more detail coming out of the subcommittees that ends up in the plan, how do we have thoughtful sort of supplemental material or annexes or things like that? So I'll just put that out there as one of the challenges that I'm sure will arise in the fall, is how to take all the material coming from subcommittees, trying to get it at the right altitude for a climate action plan. And if there's additional thinking and thought that's happened in the subcommittees, creating that space in some kind of supplemental material or supporting documents to that plan. So I'll flag that now. And if folks have had experience with how to do that well, so that from a communications standpoint, the plan does what it needs to do, I'd welcome that, that experience. I will say it'll be a challenge going into the fall to get that right. So if anyone has reflections on that now, that'd be great. If not, considered it flagged that that's going to be a challenge in the fall as the plan gets consolidated together. Okay. Great. All right. Before we move on to the next thing, anything else folks want to say about this topic and about the consolidated plan and what that means for your work now in subcommittees? Joey?
Just trying to wrap my head around the conversation, but appreciating it and some of the recommendations that have been made. Just reading Jared's comment about the funding component, I think that's a really important nuance that I'd like us to be considering. I'm also interested in us like thinking about and making recommendations that may be outside of our purview, but could point to setting, you know, a different direction. Like, for example, recommending, I mean, currently right now we have subsidies for fossil fuels baked into the US tax code, while our renewable energy sector continues to have to, you know, sort of scrape and scrap for, you know, tax credits and benefits. So I think that, again, business as usual baked into our, you know, a larger structure, you know, at the federal level is real and challenging. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And in service of trying to level the playing field, I'm interested in, back to the comment I made earlier, what are the statements we can make, the identification of things, again, outside of our influence at this moment, but a real hindrance to our ability to make progress, not only in Vermont, but regionally as a nation, and certainly. So I just wanted to underscore that.
Thanks. And if folks want to weigh in on that, absolutely, this is a good time to do that. And what I heard Secretary Moore say was, wow, I think my internet just did something strange, sorry. What I heard Secretary Moore say was what your obligations are under the Global Warming Solutions Act is to treat that as a minimum. And if you all want to make some other statements and thoughts or comment on other jurisdictions like national, I imagine you all could make a decision to do that.
Can I just add one caveat there, if I might, which is with an eye towards the fact that we have this December 1st deadline and we have to meet those minimum obligations. And I it's sort of this constant wrestling jello, it feels like at times, of trying to ensure we provide the best product, the most comprehensive look that we can, with the clear recognition that we have incredibly short time to do this work. And so just, it doesn't have to be something in the initial plan. I think the types of ideas Joey just flagged are really important ones. I'm not sure it can be a priority as we work towards the December 1st date.
Got it. Thanks. Okay. All right. Great. Well, thanks everyone. And we know this is iterative. We know it's going to evolve. So please reach out to Jane, to Marion, to others, or to me if you want to, about this as you go forward in your subcommittee work in the coming weeks. Speaking of the coming weeks, the next piece on the agenda, and I see Jane lean forward, is talking about
I don't know, Jane, if you want to pick that up. I think David froze.
Thanks, Julie. Well, I will happily pick it up. So David, while he's frozen, it is going to be my pleasure to introduce you all to our technical analysis consultants today. Before I turn it over to them to orient you to their work in the coming months, and specifically over the next 1 to 2 months, I just thought it would be important to orient you to where we are in the process, and probably we can do this at every meeting between now and December 1st. And let me just pull this up. So this is a slide that you've all seen to date, and I want to illustrate that as of setting this timeline up in this process, we are sort of moving forward with it as is outlined here. And so we're in this process right now of recognizing that the public engagement process is moving forward. And now we're really grateful to be joined by CADMIS, as well as ESG Energy Futures Group based here in Vermont, on the work associated with the technical analysis needed for the Climate Action Plan. Just as a reminder, this work will be largely happening independent of the fact that subcommittees are working to develop their first suite and larger bucket of strategies and recommendations that will be the main component of our meeting in July when we get together, which is the presentations out of rural resilience, ag and ecosystems, and cross-sector specifically, in order to launch us into the phase 2 of public engagement, recognizing that mid-July we'll have a public engagement plan put in place. So what I just wanted to show and think about today briefly is our milestones associated with this work and how it fits into the work you're going to hear a bit more in detail about from CADMIS and EFG now. The audience analysis and the round, which is comprised of a number of roundtables and interviews, is ongoing. We had our BIPOC roundtable last week, which was well attended, and I hear there was really rich discussion. We have interviews that are ongoing. This work is all being led, just as a reminder, by Climate Access and RISE Consulting. And then this week on Wednesday, we have our sector roundtable. And all of this is really not about the specifics of what would go into a climate action plan, but really reaching out to folks to understand how they want us to engage with them as we start to roll out the strategies and ultimately the draft climate action plan later this fall and winter. So that is ongoing. We are on track, and I'll just remind folks that for the week of July 12th, that steering committee meeting, when we have co-chairs present, we'll have a presentation of the public engagement plan at that meeting, as well as outreach to the subcommittees all throughout that week. That will all be ahead of you all putting together the strategies and recommendations for the July council meeting. So we're hopeful that some of that work from this initial audience analysis can be fed into that. Looking backward on this milestone, since I jumped ahead a bit to July, is a recognition that right here, we're at the Climate Council meeting on the 28th. There was a heavy emphasis and recognition that at this point in time, we would have the technical consultants on board, and we expected to bring to you some of the work that would be ongoing. What we decided to focus on today was really the bulk of the work that CADMIS and EFG are going to engage on, and then specifically the tasks that they'll be focused on over the next few weeks and months. But I do just want to highlight that there is a business as usual model that has been developed by the Public Service Department to inform this work, and subcommittees, largely the science and data and cross-sector meetings, have had in-depth presentations on that to date, as well as had an opportunity to comment and critique the methodology behind that. And so there'll be some revisions and discussion there, as well as TJ and others can speak to this better than me, but the first single mitigation pathway that SEI and NESCOM are developing should be done, if it isn't done, around now, and science and data and others will be digging into that as well. So for now, everything seems to sort of be on track to get us to the fall, and just a recognition that this work that is happening now with CADMIS and EFG will be a lot for science and data and cross-sector and others really who are diving into this to manage over the coming months. But I really am excited about the team that we have on board to do this work. And I'm excited that we have Liz Hansen from CADMIS and David Hill from EFG today to walk us through a presentation about their work, so that you all can sort of understand the breadth and depth at which we're exploring the mitigation pathways and the work needed to support that work. So I'm going to stop sharing and hope that I can turn it over to Liz or David Hill, whoever, which one of you would like to kick us off today.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I think I'll kick us off, but we'll definitely have David and Jillian Galford as well introduce themselves and their teams. So hi all, thanks for including us today. It's been a really incredible discussion so far, and we're excited to be sharing the small piece of the work that we'll be supporting today. So just by way of background, my name again is Liz Hansen. I'm a senior associate in CADMIS's Sustainability and Energy Group. My background is in state and local government, so worked for a number of years in Massachusetts, including at their Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and then in local government in New York. At CADMIS, I continue to focus on state and local decarbonization efforts. Recently was involved in the Massachusetts decarbonization roadmap that was completed along with David. And for this work, I'll be the project director on the CADMIS side, so making sure that we meet all the important deadlines that you have and sort of integrate work across tasks. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Megan Lynch, who will be our project manager, and Chad Laurent, who will be advising on the project and was also integral in Massachusetts. And with that, I think, David, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and EFG.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. David Hill with Energy Futures Group in Heinsberg, Vermont. I joined Energy Futures Group in January of 2020. Before that, I worked with the EIC, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, for 22 years. Have done a lot of work on scenario analysis and planning, using the tool that the department is working with for the business as usual and the mitigation strategies, the LEAP model. We worked on Vermont Solar Future, Solar Market Pathway study a number of years ago. And as Liz mentioned, we also used the LEAP model in the work for the Massachusetts Decarbonization Roadmap. I will be working on the greenhouse gas inventory. I'm kind of leading the work for that task group. and then also with the cost of carbon and the social cost of carbon elements. So we'll talk a little bit about those today. My EFG colleagues include Chris Nemi, Richard Fazy, Gabrielle Stebbins, and Liz Bourdet, who will be working on this, and they all have extensive background with Vermont's energy systems and some with greenhouse gas accounting. And we're looking forward to working with everyone. Thanks for your work.
Jillian, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Jillian Galford. I'm research faculty at the University of Vermont, and I sit primarily in the Gund Institute and in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. My expertise in the areas of interest in research are on land cover and land use change, and particularly feedbacks to carbon and nitrogen cycles. So my work on this project is looking at the greenhouse gas emissions and as well as carbon stocks. I'm working with a small team of other researchers. So Jonathan Thompson from Harvard Forest is coming in as our forestry expert. And we're also engaged with Heather Darby, who many know by reputation and her excellent knowledge of agriculture and land use across Vermont, as well as a few other research technicians and such who will support us on that work. I should mention I know many of you also through another hat I wear, which is the Vermont Climate Assessment. Some of you who I've seen in the last week talking about that. So kind of two different hats that I'm interacting with you all on the Climate Council.
Thanks, Jillian. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let me know when you can see it. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep,
Great.
you're good now. Thanks.
So where we want today to orient you to the work that we'll be doing, which Jane sort of gave a bit of a preview of, and then get into detail on tasks 1 and 3, which as you'll see are the bulk of the work that we'll be doing sort of this summer. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of follow-on work that will continue in August, September, October, November. But as we're kicking off and really embedding methodologies and approaches and data sets and all of those good things into tasks 1 and 3, wanted to make sure that you were aware of the work that had happened there. So we'll have David and Jillian go into some detail. So just quickly, sort of at the top, as Jane and Secretary Moore have mentioned, our work is quite fast-paced, as is yours. So right now, what we're really focused on is the review of the current greenhouse gas inventory, developing the carbon budget, and starting on that cost of carbon and social cost of carbon review. So by the end of July, we're hoping to have you sort of draft and final GHG inventory report and presentation, which David will talk a little bit more about what will be included in that. Recommendations for a replicable methodology that you all can use as part of the development of the carbon budget. And Jillian will talk a little bit more about that. And then again, draft and final review of that PSC cost of carbon analysis that's ongoing and the ways that that can be incorporated into this work. Once those are complete or in process, we will be moving on to obviously completing that carbon inventory report by September so that you have that fully built out. Moving on to the economic analysis, which we've already talked a little bit about this morning, and then getting into the initial pathway analysis based on the recommendations that you have provided and some of the work that we'll also be doing around the strategies that can get you to the goals that are set in the GWSA, and alongside putting together a draft emissions and tracking and reporting tool. So making sure that the criteria that you're setting and sort of in particular, that criteria around sort of how to measure progress, that we are linking up with you on that and making sure that we are providing you with a recommendation about sort of how to keep tabs on those things. Obviously, everything happening in that second column, we're not waiting until August to start. It's just on a slightly longer burn, but we will start teeing up approach to the economic analysis and the pathway analysis starting now. And then the fall will really be about putting a sort of a bow on each of those, making sure that you have final reports as you are pulling together the CAP so that all of the technical analysis can be integrated into that. So I will pause there and see if there are any questions sort of on the overall flow of the project. If you have detailed questions about methodology for tasks 1 to 3, would ask that you hold them so that David and Jillian can do their best to describe them before we dive in. But any questions on sort of the flow of our work and how it integrates with yours for either myself or for Jane? David, I might look for your help to see if anyone's raised hands, because now that I'm
Sure.
sharing, I'm not
I
seeing
don't
them.
see any. Yeah.
I'm not, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, then hopefully that means Jane and I have explained it well multiple times. So I won't take up any more time then, and I will turn it over to what I'm sure you're all waiting for, which is to dive into the tasks, and ask David if you would like to take over for task 1.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you all for being here. The details of greenhouse gas inventory reporting are, of course, wildly exciting. They're important. You know, when you're looking at a greenhouse gas inventory, you want to make sure that you're being comprehensive, that you're not double counting. The Agency of Natural Resources is the entity in Vermont that's responsible for conducting Vermont's greenhouse gas inventory. People may be familiar that there are individual entities sometimes that track and report their own greenhouse gas, but this is at the state level. And it can be informed by individual reporting, but it's also important that the state reports to EPA, EPA reports internationally to the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, on the inventory on a regular basis. The inventory is what is used to establish the targets that the Global Warming Solutions Act is requiring that Vermont identify pathways to meet. And so what we are aiming to do, it's you know, thank you for being very thoughtful about developing a scope of work. Within the coming month, we will not solve all of the potential issues or questions that there are in the international community, the scientific community, et cetera, on greenhouse gas accounting. There will still be questions after the end of this month that we haven't, you know, that aren't addressed or that are still evolving. But what we want to do is look at what Vermont is doing currently, compare that to several states, compare that to the Environmental Protection Agency and the International Panel on Climate Change guidelines. Look for places where there may be opportunities to expand and or enhance what Vermont is doing, and discuss the implications of that type of change. To be frank right now, given the overall time frame, et cetera, my guess is that recommendations that might come out of this could inform things that actually happen as part of the existing climate plan, but it's not as though we're going to change the inventory in the coming month. I don't think that it would be appropriate, or it's not that helpful for changes to be put into place on a very tight time frame on the current inventory. But looking at how the inventory is constructed, what others are doing in this realm, and having a critical review and analysis of the inventory, as well as potentially some sensitivity analysis of, well, if we did change a certain factor or a certain time horizon over which we're looking at global warming potentials, what difference might that make? In many cases, it's likely that while there could be technical changes that might tweak an inventory, the overall strategies, mitigation strategies, the resilience, all of these things aren't going to change at the top level. So just keeping that in mind. There's also stakeholder interest and comments that the committee and the subcommittees have gotten on this. So there are, you know, there are concerned or interested voices in the community that are recommending that there are changes that are required or that you would like to think about in an inventory methodology. We want to make sure that those are recognized, given, you know, a place to voice concerns and or to look at analysis that might, ways that we might change the analysis that can be helpful going forward. So those are some of the overarching elements that we want to keep in mind. So we had a good, we got started, you know, we've been started now just for a little bit. Last week, we had very good discussions with Agency of Natural Resources and the Data and Science Subcommittee task leads on clarifying some of the key terminologies and the roles that the different groups will be playing in terms of providing feedback and review on the work that we're doing. There, in the scope of work, there was an explicit call out for consumption-based inventory estimation. And I will put this into a very brief summary of what a consumption-based inventory might look like. It is taking account of consumption-based activities in Vermont. So if we are consuming products that are produced outside of the state of Vermont, are the greenhouse gas emissions from those products that happen outside the state of Vermont being counted in our greenhouse gas inventory? Generally, the boundaries kind of on what's called a sector-based consumption approach is that you would count the emissions inventory, the emissions that come from within your state, and not necessarily in your inventory count the upstream or the life cycle emissions from the production of products, say in China, that are imported into Vermont and consumed in Vermont. There's some interesting, the boundaries both in time and space of what you put around a greenhouse gas inventory and how you do that consistently across different jurisdictions are important, and they're not all completely settled. Consumption-based, upstream, life cycle emissions, these are all terms that get used. They help to inform decision-making for consumers, and also it can help to inform decision-making on the policy level. They are typically not the framework which greenhouse gas accounting reporting at the state level or international level are typically using. To again, probably simplify a little bit, one of the potential issues is, if you think about it, if you're trying to count for Vermont's consumption-based, the upstream emissions elsewhere, there's potential to either be double counting or over counting emissions that are counted elsewhere as part of their emissions inventory. If a production facility, for example, if the production of gasoline and natural gas down in the Gulf states, if it's being accounted, the emissions impacts are being accounted for in inventories there, it's potentially double counting for us to count those emissions in Vermont. So there are boundary issues and ways to approach this. It again can be useful to help inform both consumer and policy related issues, but there are boundaries around consumption-based inventories. Our initial scope of work included some outreach to Minnesota and Oregon, which are two states that have somewhat I think Oregon's work was earlier in the decade. It was around 2013 to 16. They've developed consumption-based inventories and they have used them. We were going to have some detailed interviews with those folks. I think based on our discussion with the Data and Science Subcommittee task leads and ANR, we agreed that we will probably do that more as a literature review and focus a little bit more on methods that have been used or are being considered by other states with relation to upstream emissions, for example, from hydro, the impacts of hydro and Hydro-Quebec. California deals with the emissions and has documented how they quantify the emissions from the Columbia River hydro. There are differences between existing and new impoundments. There's extensive literature and sometimes conflicting literature about what the proper emissions factor to use for hydro is. And what we'll try to do is highlight, identify those, and again, perhaps do some sensitivities, but I don't think that we'll be changing Vermont's current greenhouse gas inventory method. So one of the important elements then of that is to say, this is what Vermont's current greenhouse gas inventory method is, and try to say, this is where what the EPA uses, which is called the state inventory tool, is used in the data sources. This is where we are complementing that with other data sources. We had a very good talk with many of you, I'm sure people know Billy Cost, or excuse me, Colin Smythe from A&R has been the lead person at A&R working on the inventory. And we had a very good chance to review the inventory with him to get the tool last week. We will be developing follow-on questions and meeting again with him on July 6th. And one of the things we identified as I think will be very helpful is to have a matrix that says by sector and by greenhouse gas, this is how Vermont's current greenhouse gas inventory works. And then we're on a stable platform where we can say, and this is how it compares to what's going on in other states. This is how it compares to what is with the IPCC guidance, et cetera. So that's that discussion of matrix mapping, SIT, and complementary methods by sector. We will do, it's very helpful. We need to recognize New York State and California have more than one staff person working on their greenhouse gas inventories, but comparing and contrasting to some other states, I think will help the state as well as people who are raising issues with Vermont's greenhouse gas inventory give some context. I think we can come up with, there's been, I'm sorry, I put in acronyms here and my apologies. We used to have to put a quarter on the table when we used an acronym and people didn't know what it meant, and I had to do that a lot. So I apologize for that. But the global warming potential horizons, whether you're accounting for a 20 or 100-year horizon, and whether it's from the annual or the assessment report 4 or 5 from the IPCC, they have increased potentially some of the global warming potential for methane. The inventories that states are using, even though AR5 has updated the global warming potential for methane, inventories, the current generation of inventories that are being reported consistent with Vermont still use AR4. It's an example of the type of thing that we will identify, and we can do, again, a sensitivity. One of the benefits of the LEAP model, which we mentioned earlier, is that emissions factors and different sets of emissions factors can be used relatively easily to test sensitivity of overall results to things like global warming potential, the time horizon, the emissions factors, and those types of things. So our work, if well done, will help to inform decision-making and help to identify areas where a certain factor or a certain global warming potential, yes, this could have a rather large impact, or no, it really, in the large scale, is not that large an impact. At the bottom is a very accelerated schedule, and we'll be working hard to get a report and presentation that will try to summarize these things. So we have a bunch to cover other than the greenhouse gas inventory, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions. One thing, it will tie in with the work that Jillian and Jonathan Thompson and the whole team is doing on the carbon budget as well. So there will be ties there.
Any questions for David about the work around the inventory and all the good explanation he just provided?
I just, Jared raised this up already in the chat, but just a reminder that there'll be a much deeper dive into the greenhouse gas inventory this Wednesday as a workshop is being offered by the Science and Data Committee, which I circulated to council and subcommittee members at the end of last week. So if you're really interested in getting into it, and it's all, it'll be Wednesday at 1:30. And it's also a chance, since there's been extensive public interest in this component of the work, for the public to have a more extended time to comment and have discussions with them around this task.
Great. And I'll just lift up Abby's comment in the chat about concerns on the way agriculture is managed in these budgets. And so, clearly that's something that's of interest to this council. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks, David. Liz, do you want to keep moving with the next piece?
Yep. I think Jillian, you're up next to talk about task 2, and I'm sure that agriculture will come up.
Yeah, so task 2 is really concerned with stocks and fluxes of greenhouse gases across the land use sectors. We'll be working a little bit with David's group to fill in some of the anthropogenic sources like fuels, but primarily within my domain are stocks and fluxes within land cover and land use. So Jonathan Thompson is working on this, particularly for the forestry sector. So he will be analyzing historical changes in carbon stocks and forests. I should, before I launch into this too much, just really clarify that the initial scope of this task was retrospective. So a focus on 1990 to the present. But based on feedback we've been getting from the council and Jane, we are looking to add some additional work that would consider future scenarios, which is something Jonathan and I have both worked on with regards to land cover and land use change. So today I think I'm mostly going to talk about that retrospective look, but just know that we're trying to develop methods and rely on methods we already know that can translate well to future looking scenarios as well. So clearly, trying to look at stocks and fluxes is going to be very well informed by the work that David's group is doing on task 1, and particularly when it comes to understanding the nuts and bolts of current inventory practices within the states, within the state, and decisions that have been made within the state. So super important to get informed by that inventory that we just heard about with David. So Jonathan is a new addition to our team. So we're still working on exactly the full scope there, but the idea again is using observed data from forests to track carbon, and that accounts for things like harvested carbon as well. We've started meeting with different stakeholders. So last week was a focus primarily on the forestry staff, reviewing Jonathan's methods, making sure that that was the right approach. And then I think, as I see just came up in the chat too, that there's need for some follow-on, particularly when it comes to agriculture and land use change. And you know, these areas are definitely tricky because we're always working with whatever data is available and the best possible knowledge of that data to use it appropriately. So I think there's some additional discussions before we make any final decisions on certain things. So again, the bullet point there is bed assumptions and analysis with key contacts. So that's in process for sure. But ultimately our job is to conduct research and develop the carbon budget framework. So again, the initial focus is 1990 to present. And then we will be looking in the future to develop more work potentially on scenarios. The modeling approach that we use for land use and land use change is based on the exact model, which is a model I've used quite a bit for these types of applications and comes out of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, very analogous to the EPA calculator that the state has used in the past. So our data and findings will be available in mid-July, and the final report for this task is scheduled for September. I think that covers it, but I'm happy to pause and take questions. I know I've thrown out a lot and maybe a little bit less detail than David, but I'm also really hoping that we can follow up with additional conversations, as came up in the chat, to really specifically talk about some of these details and you know, let everybody kind of look under the hood, so to speak.
Questions for Jillian? I've got a question for Jane or Jillian, which is just if someone could draw a very clear link between carbon budget and the work of the Climate Council and how those things could intersect, I think would be helpful for those who are less steeped in this work.
I was almost going to put that in the chat, David, because I think this takes us a lot back to the conversation we were having earlier about performance metrics or goals. for the ag and ecosystems subcommittee in particular, but it's really important to understand what the sequestration potential and trends associated with that have been, and what the idea is moving forward of what our potential would be within absence of changing or doing dramatic different policies and strategies. And so I think this is really important in order for us to think about how we goal set or set a metric around what the sequestration component would be. And this is as a reminder that there is one in the statute around being net zero across all sectors by 2050. But I've heard many of you and all of us talk about how if and when we meet the statutory requirements for emissions reductions, we'll actually be net zero sometime in the early 2030 timeframe. And so if sequestration potential was to stay the same as it is now. So what does that mean for us? It's, the 2050 metric is somewhat meaningless. And maybe we want to set a harder goal or a bigger goal. So I think this is really important context setting for that, and understanding the value and the multiple benefits around our forests and wetlands and natural systems in Vermont.
Yeah, as well as agriculture. I've worked a lot on carbon sequestration internationally, where many countries are looking to agriculture to sequester carbon and kind of solve a big chunk of their emissions reductions contribution. But this type of work, I think, really helps highlight which of these dynamics are slow and which ones are fast. So soil carbon I put in a very slow dynamic pool. Jonathan's work on forestry helps us partition and understand the different pools of carbon from forestry. So carbon that gets stored, say in furniture or timber, long-term goods versus slash and pulp. So I would hope that really lays some of the foundation in terms of the science and the concepts. And it leads itself really nicely into then also considering those future scenarios. Certainly from a modeling of land use standpoint, it sets up all the all the formats so that we can sort of run some hypothetical scenarios, plausible futures for Vermont.
That's really helpful. Questions for Jillian on this piece of the CABMIS puzzle? Great. I'm not seeing hands, so thanks. That must have been very comprehensive, Jillian. Appreciate it.
Look forward to talking to you all more about this.
Back to David Hill to talk about task 3.
Thanks, Liz. And thank you, Jillian. So task 3 has, in the near term, so task 3 is overall has the economic analysis. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, one of the challenges is going to be to get the economic analysis. We're going to have the mitigation pathways, and that comes a little bit later. But early on in the coming month, 2 of the things we're going to focus on are questions around the social cost of carbon and how that is methodologically, how that's developed, and then also the sensitivity of that in particular to the determination of a discount rate, or to assumptions about how bad, I hate to say it, how bad things are going to get in the global environment. So if emissions are not tracking down, the impacts, potentially the impacts are much higher. And so what we've proposed to do is there are some very helpful tools from Resources for the Future that have looked, in the Obama administration, there was an intergovernmental panel on the social cost of carbon. And they looked at what are called the integrated assessment models. And these take the best, in terms of the best scientific, peer-reviewed models on both the geophysical level of the implications of certain levels of greenhouse gas concentrations and the feedbacks from the global environment, related to economic models that incorporate, incorporate items such as, the demographics, economic growth, technological progress, and these types of things. And you can choose different, again, the IPCC, the Panel on Climate Change, has developed a number of global warming, scenario cases. There's good technological advancement. Country strategies are making progress, emissions are coming down. You can take one of those scenarios, or alternatively, we're back to kind of business as usual. There's not global cooperation on reducing emissions. Everybody's going their own way. Emissions are still going up. What are the social costs of carbon? And there are two elements that I'll talk about with social cost of carbon under those different scenarios of this is how bad or good the globe is doing towards meeting its climate reduction targets. The social cost of carbon can be based on a damage-based assessment, and this is obviously not exact, but it helps to give an idea of the implications. What's the value from the damages that will be avoided? And this is not, or let me rephrase this. Vermont could decide to do something that would estimate just the damages avoided for Vermont, or in this framework, people are commonly thinking, okay, is this just domestic or just our jurisdiction, or are these global damages? Are we considering global damages? The integrated assessment models, the tool that Resources for the Future provided, allows you to run, we can do sensitivities using different models, different scenarios within those models, and say, this is what the damage-based estimate at a global level of the social cost of carbon is. And then we can say, and if we have a higher or lower discount rate, and I will, spoiler alert, the discount rate does make a large difference. It makes a big difference whether you're discounting at 2% or 3% for something like this. And there's not a right answer, but there are certainly things to consider in terms of intergenerational equity, social policy and other things. So we can help to inform the difference between Vermont saying we're taking a global damage-based approach and we're using a discount rate of 2% or 3%, or in the past administration here, some of the US analysis that was going on had moved towards a discount rate of 7% and just considering domestic damages. That has a vast impact on what you're doing in terms of the social cost of carbon. Now, the social cost of carbon is important because, as we talked about in terms of how will this be paid for, et cetera, accounting for the damages related to greenhouse gas emissions and considering those and the damages that we will be avoiding. I think Chris Campany mentioned earlier, that's one part of the equation. What are we avoiding? So this is a way that Vermont can tap into the best research and activities that are going on at the international level on these things, on the social cost of carbon. Another approach, and Vermont also, Vermont participates in the New England Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study, which uses both, and this is conducted by Synapse on a regular basis, Synapse Energy Economics. That uses both a damage-based as well as a marginal abatement cost methodology. And so another approach is to say, well, what is the most expensive, if we can, once we've done some scenarios and different things, to reach Vermont's targets, what's the most expensive measure that we're putting in place that helps us, that's required for us to reach our targets? In the recently published, the latest Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study for New England, published by Synapse this past spring, identified offshore wind and the production of renewable natural gas from power to gas as the two marginal abatement cost metrics that could be used to develop a marginal abatement cost of carbon. So we'll also be looking at what the difference between, say, damage and abatement cost methodologies would be. This is an active area of discussion. It's important to consider and account for the costs of carbon from damage, or how much would it cost to abate if we were going to meet these targets. But again, Vermont's work in this and in the next couple of weeks is not going to solve all the questions. So, but what we'll try to do is provide good information that will help to inform the decision making, both for the plan this fall and then going forward, and identify the important issues that we want to communicate to the public as well as to decision makers. So we have the schedule is down below. This is on the social cost of carbon element of, again, task 3 is much larger than this, but this is one piece that we're working on. Let me stop there. We'll switch over to the cost of carbon model that TJ and the Public Service Department have developed. So that's another bit of what I'm going to talk with you about, but just to see if there are any questions or comments on the social cost of carbon might be helpful right now.
Any quick clarifying questions for David?
I don't see hands. Okay. Thank you for everybody's patience. There's a lot in these, and
David, I think you might have a hand from Richard.
Hey,
Richard, do you have a question?
David, yeah, and Liz, thanks for exposing us to the complexities of this analysis. I do have a question for David. Do you expect that your team will be making a recommendation on the discount rate that would be appropriate for analysis in Vermont? Or are you more likely to just say, well, if it's 7, here's how it looks, and if it's 2, here's how it looks, and if it's 0, here's how it looks?
That's a good question, Rich, and I would ask for guidance from you all. My impression is that it's most appropriate for us to provide the information. We may not, I may personally argue against using 7% as a discount rate for this type of thing, but that's besides the point. So we can present information. I think that's our primary role. There are some elements in the greenhouse gas inventory where it's kind of best practices and recommendations. If the Climate Council or if the subcommittees would like us to make recommendations, we can within our scope. But I also think the primary role, even if we're making recommendations, I would only do that in a fashion that would say our primary role is to provide information and analysis.
Thank you.
Thoughts on that? I mean, do people think that the sole role could be information and analysis, or we don't need to decide it now, but I just wonder.
Secretary Young?
Yes, thank you. My 2 cents would be that the role of the consultant is, to give us all the models and let those who are the policymakers and the decision makers in this area, which would be the Climate Council, to work those into the to their thinking. I mean, it's much like our, actuaries on our pensions. They tell us the implications of the different discount rates, and then the retirement boards determine which ones they are going to recommend the legislature apply. So I see it that way, but certainly we should have further discussion, perhaps at the steering committee or another council meeting.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very helpful.
Rich, we probably need to keep rolling on this. So if this is, maybe you and David could take that up as sidebar? If you want to keep going on discount rates. Okay, cool. Thanks. David, go ahead, please. And we will need to be finishing up this conversation in the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, I'm going to go more quickly then. The cost of carbon model, TJ and other supporting staff at the department have worked on kind of a snapshot of what mitigation strategies there are currently in the energy sector in Vermont and characterize the cost per reduced ton of emissions from those. Importantly, that's a great basis to work upon, to work with. So part of our task is to review and to try to think about ways in which the cost of carbon model can be further developed so that it provides good inputs into the modeling that SEI is doing with the LEAP model, and to say capture things such as, okay, the cost of mitigation for say a heat pump strategy today in 2020 is X. In 2025, we have, from the work that EFG does around the country, we have projections of what, say, heat pump costs and savings are likely to be in the future. And again, it's literature-based reviews and those types of things. So a little bit more of a forward-looking analysis and incorporating those kinds of inputs into the SEI scenarios will be very helpful. Related to the discussion, that second main bullet related to the discussion earlier on equity issues, to the degree that we can get finer grain detail on costs and savings by income class, by measure in Vermont, we can do some research, with data sets that through the department and or the Office of Economic Opportunity or others are able to provide. We can try to help parse that out in a little bit more depth and detail. Those can be important and helpful new information. And again, an accelerated schedule for everything at the bottom. Under 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. All right. What's next from Cadmus? Is there another piece of this?
David, did you want to go into the task 3 questions, or should we?
We have a little time to do this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there are, as I mentioned, the scenarios that you use, depending on what global patterns are happening with economic growth, equity, technological sharing, et cetera, those have an impact on what your social cost of carbon damage base would be. We probably will do both a complementary investigation of damage and the marginal abatement cost methods, again, to inform, not to necessarily say one is better than the other. And this says we plan to use global as opposed to domestic damage, because I think that the domestic damages for the work that Jillian's done on the climate assessment for Vermont may have some kind of Vermont based, but I don't think that we would be using Vermont or specific US based damages when we look at damage. So the damage base will be on global damages. And then I mentioned the ideas that under the cost of carbon model bullets. And then I guess just the questions at the bottom, we're pretty much opening the floor for that. Are there any concerns or recommendations or additional resources that you'd all like to point us to?
Secretary Young?
Yeah, I will just speak for myself again. Some of this is very complex, and I'm not sure, speaking personally, I won't speak for the rest of the council, that some of these questions I could address right now with a short presentation, such as global as opposed to domestic damage impacts, whether, what that means. So in terms of, again, it's just really, I need to dive into some of this in any material that you might be presenting to us before I could really address whether these approaches meet expectations, at least mine anyway, or if I have concerns.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Other reactions or thoughts to these questions that folks want to lift up right now? Chris?
Yeah, I guess I was put in chat, just how broadly we're defining costs, and then just a topic that I'm particularly interested in, wearing my municipal interest hat. I know this is going fairly far broad, but among those costs, I'm wondering if we're going to look up. What's that? Okay.
Just some feedback.
Wondering if there's going to be the opportunity to look at any assumptions or concern or issues or thoughts about especially displacement along coastal Northeast, what that might mean for Vermont in terms of population, and because that gets into a number of different issues, especially related to land use, governance, and other things like that.
Yeah, I think that broadly speaking, these will tend to be at a very high level, taking into account, say, if you're using global, the implications of displacement, population displacement, loss of property value, those types of things for coastal areas, but not necessarily at the level of New England, say, regional level. Now, and that could be an example of the type of thing that if important looking forward, there would be more research and or say collaboration with the New England regional, that type of thing. What does it mean at our regional level? The work that I'm referencing here and the things that have been done tend to be at the broader global potential, both geophysical as well as the economic feedbacks and impacts. But yeah, thank you. That's a good point to mention. And I think that's the type of thing we'll be able to call out, is that if you wanted to look at this more regionally specific, there would be additional research that would be required.
Great. Anything else of immediate feedback for David right now? Okay, great. All right.
I'll just quickly wrap us up. As we noted, we were focusing just on the task 1, 2, and 3A, since those are on such a quick timeline. So we're also reviewing approaches for the economic analysis, the pathway analysis, and the tracking tool within our IT staff, and working on developing a scope of work to collaborate with the Stockholm Environmental Institute, who, as Jane mentioned, has already done a business as usual case, which I think was presented to the council through the LEAP modeling, to make sure that our work is integrated with theirs. We'll also make sure to follow up with Jane when we're meeting with her tomorrow about sort of next steps from here of, are there subcommittee presentations or particular folks that we should be engaged with to do that sort of deeper dive that Secretary Young recommended, or making sure that folks really understand some of the more technical bits here and what they mean in terms of the work that you're doing, and how what we'll be producing will be supporting your decision making. So I think that's all from us. Again, unless there's any last minute questions on that, but otherwise, David, happy to turn it back to you.
Great, Liz. Yeah, we do have a moment here. Folks have additional questions for how CABMIS is going to be supporting you all in this emissions work. I see Jane's throwing something in a chat. Again, this is connected with what the other modeling that's being done as part of the comprehensive energy plan. If there's anything else that needs to be said about that intersection, that connection, I welcome Jane or anybody to clarify. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jillian. That's great. I mean, it's a level of detail that I think is like, some of us are hanging on by a thread. So I will just note that, it's like some of us who are not as, some of you or us who are not as steeped in all the intricacies. I know that's a high level of technical challenge there. And so please do feel free to reach out to folks if you'd like some more individualized help around this.
Yeah.
David, can I just make one comment real quick?
Mm-hmm.
I did just want to suggest that I think it was important for you all to meet the team here, as they'll be working really kind of tirelessly on this work over the next 6 months. But I do just want to introduce, which I have been as we've had our task kickoff meetings, that we've been really thoughtful at the subcommittee level of compiling the right suite of a smaller group of folks to help inform the work of each specific task, recognizing that they are quite detailed and challenging with respect to the technical expertise needed to manage them. But we've done a really good job of getting the right folks around the table. And I do just also want to highlight the role of the Agency of Natural Resources in managing these contracts. And so that I encourage folks, if you have any questions or anything about how we're moving forward with any of the tasks, to run those comments through me, and I will help put you in touch with the right group or cast a wider net when we have our smaller meetings associated with each of the tasks. So lots of work moving forward with this, and we'll think about the right level of detail and the right amount of discussion to bring forward to the full council in the coming weeks and months, but just recognize that all of these tasks are being managed in coordination with the subcommittees as well.
Thanks, Jane. I noticed that Sue dropped in the chat her interest in thinking about intergenerational equity and how that relates to discount rate assumptions and things like that. So that may be something to follow up on, and with perhaps at the full council or some subgroup that wants to work on that. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Yeah. And we're so lucky to have Cadmus and company on board now and working full speed ahead, because that's an amazing support for this, for all of you. Richard?
Yeah, I simply want to chime in to say having EFG and Cadmus on board is terrific. It's great progress to have good people helping us.
Yeah, great. Okay, super. That's as far as we wanted to get with that, I think. And I've managed to misplace my agenda. Jane, do we have anything else that we're doing before we do some public comment around this? Oops.
Yeah, the next on
That's
the
all I
agenda
got.
is public comment.
Great.
Mhm.
So why don't we do some public comment? So I welcome folks in the chat. This is actually a good time for the public to use the chat. I should have said earlier that this is the right time for the public to use the chat. So I welcome folks to raise their hand among the members of the public or others who are joining us today. Or I believe you have access to the chat, so you can drop something in the chat as well. So I'll just wait a moment and see if any of the folks joining us on the line today would like to offer a comment around what we've been talking about so far. And you should have access to the chat as well if it's more comfortable for you to use the chat. I'm just going to give it another moment to see if we have. I'm just noticing a chat from Annette Smith. Yes, concerned about the problems we had with Zoom. And I'll just read this comment from Annette saying, I realize there are problems with Zoom this morning, but in general, please set up the Zoom so that all participants can be seen. If we were in the room in person, we would be able to see everyone. It feels uninviting to not know who is present. Thanks, Annette. And I think there may be some changes next meeting about how we're using Zoom, considering the frustrations we had this morning. Any other members of the public who'd like to make a comment, either in the chat or verbally? Please just use your raise hand function in Zoom if you'd like to raise your hand. Okay, great. Okay, so that brings us to our next steps in closing up. Secretary Young, do you want to lead us on some sort of roundup and next steps where we're headed?
Well, it was quite an action-filled meeting, but I think that what is teed up in the agenda for next steps captures most of what we talked about today. We've talked about the public engagement plan and presentations on that. The steering committee will be meeting on July 12th. And Jane, just point of clarification, are we expecting the consultant to present the public engagement plan to the steering committee and subcommittee chairs on July 12th and then to the actual subcommittees? Okay, great. So that's something to look forward to in the next 2 weeks. We just learned about the inventory critique that we will I'm making my conclusion from today is that will come from Cadmus sometime in mid-July. I think it's a target date of July 19. If I'm wrong there, Jane, you can correct me.
Looks good.
All
That sounds
set? Good.
Thank you.
Okay. And then again, our next climate council meeting is July 26th, and we will be talking draft strategies that will be presented from 3 of the 5 cross-sector mitigation, ag and ecosystems, and the rural resilience and adaptation subcommittees. So that'll be I think real progress to get something in draft form to look at. So looking forward to that. Other than that, if I missed anything, let me know, Jane, but.
Sounds good.
Great. And again, we will be working through some of the issues with Zoom over, the next, before the next meetings, make sure that everyone is comfortable that they are able to participate fully as a public attendee. So thank you for those comments. And with that, thank you all. David, I think we can adjourn unless someone has anything more to add.
We'll just do a quick check-in. Is there anything that feels burning that people want to just flag before we sign off today? I think we've probably worn everybody out this morning. So thanks everyone for hanging in there. It's really hard work that's going on right now in the subcommittee. So we're extremely grateful about all that work that's happening. Take care. Have a good holiday break or over the 4th, and we will be in touch. We'll see you all together again in a month, next meeting. All right. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.